Distinguished heads of state and government, viewers joining us from across the world online. Welcome to the 2020 Sustainable Development Goals Moment. My name is Sherman Bryce-Pease and I have the honor to moderate this first SDG moment of the Decade of Action convened by the United Nations Secretary-General, His Excellency Antonio Guterres. This meeting is a curtain raiser to the most unique and perhaps significant high-level week in the United Nations' 75-year history. And to be clear, that is quite an intentional statement we make here today. And it will be this meeting is, of course, a curtain raiser to the most unique and perhaps significant high-level week, as I just said. It will be followed tomorrow by the premiere of a very special broadcast, Nations United. See what we did there? Which will seek to bring the SDGs and the Decade of Action to the widest possible public audience. We will begin today with a short excerpt from that film. Take a look.
This is a very important story. The important story. In the midst of COVID-19, it's an historic opportunity to look at the facts of the world as it is, and then to focus on the solutions to some of our greatest problems.
Today, we feel the weight of history on our shoulders. The whole planet is at stake. The way we have been moving leads nowhere, and that we need to change course.
We need to reduce global emissions by 50% by 2030. This cannot go on. You know it, I know it, and we know what we need to do.
Poverty is not natural, it is man-made, so poverty is not inevitable.
We have an enormous potential of what children can achieve together if we let them.
All people are entitled to the same respect, justice, and human rights. And yet, across the globe, this struggle is still being fought. Inequality for women is one of the world's great injustices, and it must be and will be swept away.
We are bringing young people to the table now, not as a token, but to take that baton, to take up the gauntlet, and to move forward.
Strength, power, and courage was born.
The passion for protest can turn into a passion for changing all of our behavior to create a better, safer, just, sustainable world.
It's a myth that each and every one of us doesn't have the ability to change the world dramatically and quickly. There is power in every decision we make.
People have shown an enormous capacity to adapt to new circumstances, an enormous capacity to change.
In the 75 years since the United Nations was founded, the human race has never had to face a set of challenges like we do right now. But together, we can overcome them. Nelson Mandela said, "It always seems impossible until it's done." These are some of the things that must be done.
A quote always worth repeating: it always seems impossible until it's done. South Africa's first democratically elected President, Nelson Mandela. Ladies and gentlemen, as we just saw, our world is at a critical juncture, with COVID-19 compounding a long list of global challenges. Over the next 3 hours, we will hear more about this moment in history and the bold choices required to deliver the SDGs by 2030 and the rights and wrongs in our world, looking in particular at issues of poverty and inequality, climate action, and gender equality. These three prisms offer an integrating thread across the 17 goals and are a fitting entry point for and to the Decade of Action. To begin, we will hear from the Secretary-General, a leader who has helped deliver ambitious change in countless roles, as Prime Minister, as UN Refugees Chief, and now at the helm of the United Nations. He is to my left. Mr. Secretary-General, you have the floor.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed. I'm pleased to welcome you to this SDG moment, the first in this crucial decade of action to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. Our aim is to show that transformation is possible and is happening right now in so many places, with so many innovations, and with the engagement of so many people. This annual SDG Moment is our opportunity to demonstrate that, as one united family of nations, we have what it takes to eradicate poverty and hunger, tackle climate change, deliver gender equality, and achieve all 17 global goals. And through the Nations United film that will be broadcasted tomorrow, we will bring this message to the entire world. We can make tremendous progress over the coming decade, especially for the most vulnerable and the poorest of the poor. When the public appetite for change is matched with political will and smart policy choices, rapid progress is unstoppable. But our task is daunting. The foundations of our world have been shaken to the core by COVID-19. The pandemic has pushed us towards the worst recession in decades, with terrible consequences for the most vulnerable. Societies and citizens are reeling from widespread disruption. After many years of progress, poverty and hunger are on the rise. Children are suffering from a lack of schooling. Debt is skyrocketing. Fiscal resources are plunging. And even before the virus, inequalities were growing. The benefits of globalization and growth had failed to reach millions upon millions of destitute people, deepening their already profound despair. Biodiversity was also disappearing, and greenhouse gases were at record levels. We need a path that brings health to all, revives economies, brings people in from the margins of society, and builds long-term resilience, sustainability, opportunity, and peace. Excellencies, that path exists. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is designed to address the very fragilities and shortcomings that the pandemic has exposed. And at its heart, there is a simple promise: to end poverty and to leave no one behind. Indeed, the poor have a special claim on our efforts and energies. Those most in need are often those hardest to reach and must be reached first. That means expanding social protection and ensuring universal access to essential services. It means strengthening critical infrastructure like education, health systems, and internet connectivity. And it means placing women at the center of decision-making. The 2030 Agenda also demands a swift and just transition to inclusive, low-carbon, resilient economies. This green transition can deliver more and better jobs and a cleaner environment. It will reduce the risk of future pandemics and mitigate the worst effects of climate change. In short, the 2030 Agenda provides the guiding light we need to end the pandemic, to respond to its socio-economic impacts, and to chart a course for a transformative recovery. Excellencies, public appetite for transformative change is growing. We see it in the leadership of young climate activists and in the global movements for racial justice. We see it in the millions saying no to violence and discrimination against women, no to inequality, no to corruption, and no to political repression. We are also seeing key stakeholders using their power for change. We see it in those who are committed to the global search for a universally accessible vaccine for COVID-19. And we see it in the fact that renewable energy is now more affordable than fossil fuels. More and more businesses are embracing the social, environmental, and financial triple bottom line. Cities and subnational governments are developing new models for how we live, work, and grow food, how we reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and how we embrace social diversity. But there is no escaping the fact that one critical ingredient is still missing: political will. Without it, neither public appetite nor stakeholder action will be sufficient. Excellencies, the science is clear. The people are clear. there is no time to procrastinate. The decisions taken over the next few months and years will have enormous impact on where we will be by 2030. 3 areas are particularly crucial: finance, COVID-19 recovery, and ambition. First, financing. Right now, developing countries face the dual challenges of funding the pandemic response and avoiding a major debt crisis. For the Sustainable Development Goals to stand a chance, we must address the immediate, medium, and long-term financing challenges that developing countries face. Our leaders' meeting on financing on 29th of September is an opportunity to get behind the most significant policy options. These include boosting the resources available to international financial institutions and extending the debt service suspension initiative to at least the end of 2021. And this must also entail a broadening of the initiative's scope to all vulnerable, developing and middle-income countries, such as small island developing states, as well as comprehensive debt relief for countries in need. The second priority is inclusive and green COVID-19 recovery plans. Done right, these plans can help countries to transition to a more inclusive, equitable, and sustainable economy. As we spend huge amounts of money to recover from the coronavirus, we must deliver new jobs and businesses through a clean, green transition. And that means ensuring that taxpayers' money is used for a resilient, inclusive, and sustainable recovery. It means ending fossil fuel subsidies, making polluters pay for their pollution, and ensuring that no new coal-fired power plants are built. And it means reducing inequalities and placing women, who have been among the worst affected by job losses and increased care burdens, at the center of recovery plans. Women's leadership and equal representation makes institutions and policy decisions more effective and decreases inequalities in outcomes. This has never been more important. The third priority is ambition. We need ambition and solidarity to provide the $35 billion extra needed so that COVID-19 vaccines and treatments are available to everyone fast. Ambition to cut carbon emissions by half in the next decade, paving the way to carbon neutrality by 2050. And ambition to protect biodiversity, achieve gender equality, end poverty and hunger, and fulfill the promise of the Sustainable Development Goals. Excellencies, in the midst of the greatest international crisis of their time, the founders of the United Nations raised their eyes above the horizon and planned a better, safer future. The COVID-19 pandemic, the greatest challenge faced by us since the founding of the United Nations, has brought us low. But we will not be beaten. We too must look beyond the current crisis and set our sights high as we strike out for a world of dignity and opportunity for all on a healthy planet. Together, let us make this a decade of action, a decade of ambition, a decade of transformation, a decade of hope and peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary General. The blueprint for recovery clearly is very clear. One critical ingredient that is missing: political will. Thank you for that, SG. The COVID-19 pandemic continues to rage in many parts of the world, and without the commitment and courage of frontline workers, nurses, carers, doctors, police, bus drivers, delivery drivers, cleaning staff, farmers, and more, the impacts would be much greater. So at the beginning of the decade of action, when we need to take action by everyone, everywhere, it is important that we take a moment to appreciate those everyday heroes. We will hear now from one of those heroes, Dr. Noah Biran, who was working in Hackensack University Medical Center, New Jersey, among the worst affected regions in the world by COVID-19.
Good morning. Thank you very much. On behalf of my colleagues, thank you for the opportunity to speak and to honor those who have died from COVID-19. In late February, I received a call from a physician colleague in Northern Italy. He called to beg for ventilators and other respiratory devices. He sounded desperate. he explained that hospitals were running out of both equipment and time. Several weeks later, as I walked through my own hospital's emergency room for the first time since the pandemic hit the New York area, I could hear my Italian friend's voice in my head, and I understood his desperation. Patients were dying around me. People were struggling to breathe, alone in rooms, isolated from loved ones, while staff, fully covered in PPE, were sweating as they worked without food or water from dawn until dusk. In a matter of days, entire hospital systems like my own had to be redesigned. Cafeterias were closed to accommodate intensive care unit beds. Jobs were changed. Gastroenterologists became anesthesiologists. Pediatricians had to take care of elderly patients, and nurses and staff, including those who were pregnant or had underlying medical problems, came to work, sacrificed their own safety for others. With gratitude, we accepted immense and generous support and donations from our community. But what about patients? As an oncologist, I know that cancer does not stop for COVID-19. My patients, often with a weakened immune system, were afraid to come in and receive their treatment. Unfortunately, I still see the ramifications from this pause in care. Many of my patients now have a worse prognosis because their cancer treatment was delayed or their cancer progressed while treatment was paused. Sadly, these outcomes seem to be more pronounced among minorities and those of less means. And as the fight for COVID-19 continues, we grieve with the families whose mother, father, sister, brother, or child have died. COVID-19 has taken over 950,000 lives. The memory of these people will never be forgotten, and their legacy motivates us to keep up the fight. While there is still a long road ahead, we have learned much about the virus, its course, patients at higher risk of morbidity and mortality, and effective therapies. We've proven to be resilient, resourceful, empathic, and to stand for one another in support. These are proving times, and by standing together, we can overcome this crisis. Just as I have seen my patients and colleagues rise to the challenge, I am optimistic that we as a society can do so as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Dr. Noah Biran. Our next speaker embodies much of what is needed of the world as we seek to deliver the transformation called for by the Secretary General. In 2013, her life was almost ended because she stood up for girls' rights to education. Her defiance and her resilience inspired the entire world. In 2015, right here in the United Nations, she challenged world leaders to stand up for the rights of people like her and to deliver on the promise of the 2030 Agenda. 5 years later, she is back to deliver the people's address of the 2020 SDG Moment. Ms. Malala Yousafzai, the floor is yours.
Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, friends, thank you for inviting me to speak today. When I last spoke here, I was just about to enter university. I was optimistic for what was ahead. University life, making new friends, and access to an incredible education. This June, I graduated in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of a reeling world, one many of us could not have predicted. 5 years have passed since the United Nations members agreed to the Sustainable Development Goals. These goals represent the future of millions of people, of girls who want to go to school, of women who fight for their rights, and of young people who fight for a clean air and a safe planet. So far, you have not kept up with your work. So I'd like to know, when are you planning to do the work? When will you commit the necessary funding to give every child 12 years of education? When will you prioritize peace and protect refugees? When will you pass the policies to cut carbon emissions? COVID-19 has been a striking setback to our collective goals. On education alone, 20 million more girls may never be able to go back to their classroom after this crisis ends. Global education funding gap has already increased to $200 billion per year. The pandemic is a setback, but it cannot be an excuse. Our goal should not be to return to the way things were. We need a profound commitment to the way the world should be, a place where every girl can learn and lead, a place where we put people and our planet ahead of profits, a place where leaders keep their promises. I hope you will make commitment, you will act upon them, and you will set the norms of a new era, a sustainable, healthy, educated, and equitable era. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Malala, for your determination to make change happen and for laying down a clear challenge to us all. We will round out this opening segment by hearing from the co-chair of the Secretary General's SDG advocates who play a key role in advocating for SDG action in the corridors of power and among many stakeholders across the world. I have the honor to introduce a message from Her Excellency Erna Solberg, Prime Minister of Norway, and the co-chair of the Secretary General's SDG advocates. Madam Prime Minister, the floor is yours.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, at the SDG Moment last year, I struck an optimistic tone. My message was that the world is moving forward. The SDGs were gaining traction. We were making progress. Much has happened since then. The COVID-19 pandemic has thrown us all into a crisis of yet unseen proportions. Health systems have been tested, in some cases beyond their limits. Where available, financial resources have been stretched to preserve social and economic infrastructure. And not the least, to help those who have lost jobs and thrown into uncertainty. But in too many places, the resources to save lives and livelihoods are simply not available. A looming debt crisis reminds us of the imbalances and growing inequalities in our world. Indeed, it seems the world is not moving forward. It has rather come to a standstill. The pandemic has exposed fundamental weaknesses in our global system. There can no longer be any doubt about the need for urgent global action to build a fairer and more resilient world. This is exactly what the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is all about. The high-level political forum in July charted the way forward. And allow me to highlight 3 main points. First, the pandemic strikes indiscriminately. There is no time and place to talk about they and us. Unless the pandemic is addressed as a global challenge, it will bounce back and effectively stop our chances of realizing the SDGs. Second, the development of a vaccine is of paramount importance. Norway is investing heavily in vaccine development and will strive to secure equal access for all. The major economies, the market shapers, the pharmaceutical industries, and the multilateral organizations must all work together towards this goal. And third, to build back better and greener, we need a renewed commitment to an inclusive, innovative, and resilient multilateralism. And as we rebuild from this crisis, we must do so in a manner that gives us a fighting chance when the climate crisis hits. Ladies and gentlemen, the 2030 Agenda with the SDGs sends out a steering call for transformation. Norway will continue to work closely with all of you to make this transformation come true. Thank you.
Thank you to Prime Minister Solberg. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now move into a different gear, and if you listen quietly, you'll hear the gears shifting, to provide an SDG reality check and to set the stage for our work ahead. We are 5 years into the SDGs. So what's the state of play? Are we on track or are we not? How does the situation vary from region to region, country to country? And what do we need to do differently to reach our 2030 destination? We will start with an overview of SDGs progress since 2015 from a global perspective. Each year, the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs produces the world's most authoritative report on SDG progress, which takes us through how we are faring on all the goals. In the latest report, we heard loud and clear that the world was not on track to achieve the goals by 2030. Some critical targets were even seeing reversals in progress, and COVID-19 threatens to set us back even further. Understanding data, however, is not easy, especially so when dealing with an agenda as comprehensive and complex as the SDGs. Our next speaker is a data storyteller of world renown. His organization has a very clear purpose: to tackle global misconceptions about global development. And he's here with us today to give us a different perspective on the official data and to help us all understand where we stand on the SDGs as we embark on this decade of action. It is my pleasure now to introduce Mr. Ola Rossling, co-founder and president of the Gapminder Foundation.
Thank you for this honor. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we are in a global crisis. But we humans have the exceptional ability to imagine a better world, even during crisis. And we are capable of collaborating globally to turn that imagination into reality. And I'm not saying this just to comfort you in hard times. No, this is true. And the strongest evidence I know is the fact that the United Nations exist. The UN started as an imagination during a crisis, the Second World War. Imagine a future without the Third World War. Very unlikely, said the skeptics. And yet, here we are, 75 years later, and instead of a world war, we have had amazing social progress almost everywhere. The SDGs are also an imagination in a crisis. We used to think of progress as if economy, society, and environment were separate spheres, and that mindset led to the sustainability and exclusion crisis, which we are still in now. In reality, they overlap almost completely, and our mindset is changing. We must improve people's lives while at the same time we protect the environment. That's why we have 17 goals with 169 targets. 35 of them have sufficient up-to-date numbers to track the global progress. Welcome to the global SDG race. We lined them up on the start line in 2015. Now, 5 years into the race, they should be here, 1/3 of the distance. Who is winning? Ready, set, go! Let's see, they start moving. Internet is taking off fast, and cell phones, independent human rights institutions, is moving too slow. But inclusive employment is even slower, just like overfishing. But look to the left, slum dwellings is moving the wrong way, just like unsentenced prisoners and biodiversity, while child survival, as usual, looks like a winner. So this is what it looks like right now. 6 of these targets are on track, 24 move too slow or stand still, while 5 are heading the wrong way. Let's take a closer look at some targets through 3 important focus areas: poverty and inequality, gender equality, and climate action. In the first area, extreme poverty rate had been dropping for decades to 10% in 2015, and we agreed to aim for 0. But then the drop didn't continue. Last year's forecast looked bad, and then came Corona. This is the first increase in decades, so action is needed now. Now here's some good news. We have a world record in electrification. The world population grew, but the share with electricity access grew even faster, to 89%. As more poor communities are hooked up to the power grid, it means more poor children can now turn their lamps on at night and study and get better grades and hopefully escape poverty. Many of the targets, as you see, are somehow interconnected. Now, income inequalities. We said we were going to reduce them, but that has not happened. And this may stop the progress in other targets, like maternal health. Here is our second area, gender equality. Another world record here, births attended by trained health staff, 81%. Hooray! But beware, A global average like this often hides enormous inequalities. Let's go back to 2000 and see the huge differences between countries. Bubble sizes show total number of births in each country, and colors show regions. If we spread the countries out by income, GDP per capita, we see that the richest, to the right here, all are high up and close to 100%, while the other countries are on all different levels. That was in 2000. Now we play the world forward, and it's so good to see that most countries move upwards because more deliveries are assisted. But country averages also hide enormous inequalities within the countries. I will show you. But first, we changed the bubble size to show the number of not attended births, basically the size of the problem. And now, I split the population of a country into 10 income groups, with 10% in each. Look, the inequalities within countries are often just as large as the inequalities between countries. The connection here is super strong. Here's a very different gender-related target. Women should have 50% of seats in parliaments. In 2015, we had reached 23%, and we could achieve the goal by just bending the curve up a little. But we didn't do that. If women had equal access to power, that could possibly speed up other targets as well, like putting an end to child marriage or stopping the systematic violence against women, enabling women to decide when they actually wish to become pregnant, or sharing the burden of domestic care work. And maybe even women in power would do more than men to make the climate targets start moving the right way. Who knows? So here is the third area, extremely important, climate action. On the vertical axis, carbon dioxide per person. On the horizontal axis, Human Development Index. Look closely at the left bottom corner. I just started plotting the least developed countries, and the bubble size shows total emissions, and you can hardly see them. And now, countries with higher human development, the pattern is crystal clear. And yet, there are plenty of countries with high human development and quite low emissions per person. This box shows where all countries ultimately should be. The question is, how do we get there? Let's look at electricity again. How much comes from renewable sources? Roughly some 25%. But the good news is, in many countries, renewable are now becoming cheaper than fossil fuels. So it's high time to accelerate a just energy transition now. So, in short, we are moving too slowly to achieve our goals. And I see two big reasons for this. First, we are still not appreciating how much our targets are interconnected, not just within each goal, but across the goals. We need to realize the huge overlaps, in order to switch mindset and get out of this global crisis of unsustainability and exclusion. Second, we need reliable data to know who is left out and where to focus our resources, and this is so bad. My favorite target is not moving. This target is to produce enough statistics to track all the other targets. The UN has an SDG database, and this shows how many data points there are per target. Look how it's increasing over the years, and we now have more data than ever before. But a lot is still missing. Many important things are hard to measure, and many of these indicators didn't even have an international standard back in 2015. But since March this year, they all have agreed standards. So now, let's use our imagination and imagine what a success would look like. We gather all the data points we need, and we track all the targets. And imagine we build back better after Corona, and we make all targets reach the goal line in 2030. Now, how strong is your imagination? And how strong is your ability to turn it into reality by collaborating with others? Remember, the future we're imagining here is the future of our children, my children and your children. So we, the people of the world, have really good reasons to take actions and make sure that this particular imagination becomes reality.
I mean, I kind of think that deserves a round of applause, really. We have about 20 people in the room that are refusing to join me. Can we give them a round of applause? I thought that was pretty great. I really loved the analogy of, the World Championship of Nations, or perhaps the Olympics. The question is, which countries are going to win the gold medals and the silver medals and the bronze medals in terms of SDG progress? We are literally, of course, in a race for our lives. Thank you, Ola, for that whirlwind tour of the SDGs, and especially for a reminder that humanity is capable of great progress. Ola provided a global snapshot, but he also called our attention to the data challenge that we must address to have the tools to plan and invest better. To help us to unpack this further, we need to look at the SDGs from a regional perspective. So now we will hear from the executive secretaries of the UN's 5 regional economic and social commissions. They will provide a closer look at progress and challenges across 5 different regions of the world. Like Ola, they will focus on 3 central issues at the core of the SDGs: poverty and inequality, climate change, and gender equality.
In history, there have been moments when catastrophic events wiped out any meaningful progress for the survival of humankind. From Beirut to Bangkok, from Addis Ababa to Santiago, and from Geneva to New York. The COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on all 17 Sustainable Development Goals is imperiling our shared vision to end poverty. The Arab States region is not on track to achieve the SDGs. While a few targets have already been met at the regional level, others are only achievable with structural change.
Before COVID-19, the Arab region had already seen the only increase in extreme poverty globally. The pandemic has pushed an additional 14 million people into poverty, and conflict has left 55 million in need of humanitarian assistance. The region has allocated about $100 billion, but lacks an additional 70 billion in liquidity. Arab countries have adopted the Arab multidimensional poverty framework, but they still need to adopt inclusive social protection systems that are financially sustainable, systems that are catalysts for upward mobility. The Arab region is one of the most unequal in the world. 37 billionaires own as much as bottom half of its adult population. Creating national solidarity funds that connect the wealthiest with the poorest is an innovative policy measure to alleviate poverty and reduce inequality. Shared responsibility is what the region needs.
Asia and the Pacific is not on track to meet most of the Sustainable Development Goals. Progress is slow or stagnant, and in some cases, regressing. With the COVID-19 pandemic, faster progress is needed.
Asia and the Pacific is a development success story. 80% of the extreme poor were lifted out of poverty by 2015. And yet, Asia and the Pacific is still characterized by increasing inequality and high levels of informal labor. 60% of the population is not covered by social protection. 40% have no access to health care. This ingrained inequality has been exacerbated by the pandemic. The unprecedented responses by our countries have opened up the possibility for a different future. Many have raised the level of investment in social protection and health care and targeted the segments of society that had been forgotten. Inclusive social protection policies and bringing the furthest behind to the forefront. This is our way forward.
To achieve the targets of the 2030 Agenda, the UN ECE region needs to accelerate progress. While it is on track with eradicating extreme poverty, the pandemic has exacerbated persistent inequalities. Progress has been good with some targets relevant to gender equality, though at the current rate of progress, only 40% of measured targets would be achieved.
Despite some important advances, inequalities remain a major concern for the region. The COVID-19 crisis means redoubling efforts to ensure no one is left behind. 140 million people in the pan-European region still lack access to clean water. I call on all governments to join our protocol on water and health to uphold this basic human right, which is a first line of defense against pandemic. 150 million people in the region cannot afford decent housing. With the UN regional system, UNEC supports countries to close those gaps.
The integrated spirit of the 2030 Agenda is at risk in Latin America and the Caribbean region. While a few SDG targets have already been met at the regional level, Others will only be achievable with strong policy interventions. Available data shows progress in achieving some SDG targets, but sustained efforts are required for others.
Inequality defines Latin America and the Caribbean. Wealth, income, social protection, education, knowledge, and skills are in the hands of the few. Progress made on eradicating poverty have been set back more than a decade in a matter of months. ECLAC estimates a GDP contraction of minus 9.1%, with a rise of poverty up to 231 million and 96 million in extreme poverty. Governments have provided emergency basic income to the poor and tax exemptions and grace periods to micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. ECLAC proposes to extend these measures for 9 months. We also propose a basic digital basket comprising a laptop, a smartphone, a tablet, and low-cost connectivity for households without internet. We need a political fiscal compact to ensure universal social protection.
Africa is not on track to meet most of the Sustainable Development Goals. Even before the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, Africa was not on track to meet any of the targets of SDG 1 to end poverty in all its forms everywhere. Of particular concern are the efforts towards achieving SDG 5 on gender equality. More than half of the measured climate targets would not be met unless progress accelerates.
In the last decade, Africa has made progress in reducing poverty. However, 300 million Africans still live below the poverty line. With COVID, 400 million vulnerable Africans may fall into poverty, and that will see us at about 700 million Africans falling into poverty before the end of the crisis. Africa is its first recession in 25 years. Governments will need to support the process of getting people out of poverty. We will need to do two things. The first, social protection programs. Today on the continent, we spend about $6 billion on social protection programs. We will also need to do job creating programs to ensure that particularly the youth who have fallen into poverty and are more resilient can find jobs for themselves and work their way out of poverty.
While women across Arab countries are making great strides in society and the economy, the region also has the highest level of female unemployment globally and one of the lowest levels of political participation.
Violence against women is on the rise and costs the region an estimated $245 billion. Arab countries should focus more on empowering women economically, continue to do away with social discrimination policies, and create opportunities for them. Embracing technology and creating enabling platforms that support, fund, and scale up businesses powered by women is key. Incentive measures are also needed to link women's small businesses to the region's top businesses through integrated value chains. Investing in women is critical to achieve stable, just, and prosperous Arab societies.
The pandemic risks undoing years of progress in gender equality. Millions of women's jobs in the informal sector have disappeared. Unpaid care work has increased exponentially. Thousands of small and medium-sized enterprises have closed, many of which are run by women.
Rising to the challenge of gender inequality makes the commitment of the Beijing Declaration ever more important. We are witnessing this momentum of change in the Asia-Pacific, lifting their barriers to political participation and leadership, ensuring women's economic empowerment and integration into formal economy, developing gender-responsive and inclusive social protection, and ending violence against women and girls. These are central to our commitments to achieving gender equality in Asia and the Pacific.
For gender equality, the UNEC region has made important strides towards targets on maternal, sexual, and reproductive health. But the COVID-19 crisis has disproportionately affected women both at work, where a quarter of women are in precarious jobs, and at home. Violence against women and girls has surged dramatically. Decades of progress on the empowerment of women are at risk. I encourage all stakeholders to join UNEC's efforts to promote the use of gender-specific standards. I call on governments to support women-owned small businesses to drive the recovery we need for the SDGs.
The crisis precipitated by the pandemic is having a disproportionate impact on women, who bear the brunt of an excessive burden of unpaid work, increased poverty and job insecurity, limited access to public services, and insufficient financing for gender equality policies.
Women are worse off than men in terms of discrimination, political exclusion, and lack of economic autonomy. Violence against women and girls is the tragedy of inequality exacerbated in these pandemics. The crisis is affecting women more severely as they account for more than 60% of informal labor, and confinement is placing additional pressure as primary caregivers, paid and unpaid. Women are on the front line of the response to the health crisis and are more exposed. They account for 72% of those employed in the health sector. Public care systems are being considered by the region based on examples of Uruguay and Costa Rica to open labor options for women. The region has performed well in equal education for women, which in fact reaches tertiary education more broadly than men. However, there is a need to improve their economic autonomy through access to high-quality jobs, equal pay, and financial inclusion.
90% of Africa's women work in the informal sector, and 70% work on cross-border trading or earn their incomes from cross-border trading. To ensure that these women can continue to be prosperous, one is to give them an identity. Informal economies do not generate prosperity. So finding ways of formalizing their businesses and ensuring that they become fully contributing members of society is going to help achieve gender equality. On cross-border trading, the main and most important element, particularly for women businesses, is to ensure, one, that they have access to financing, but secondly, that we can harmonize processes to ensure that when women trade across borders, Africa has 76 borders, that they meet and confront the same kinds of regulatory environments. With the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement and the prospect of harmonizing cross-border trading, we hope that we can move further into gender equality on the continent.
Economic growth in Asia and the Pacific has been coupled with increasing vulnerabilities to climate-induced disasters and rising environmental degradation.
When it comes to climate and environment, our region needs acceleration across the board. It means moving towards decarbonization by 2050, a rapid end to fossil fuel subsidies and new investment in coal, tackling air pollution, transforming to green and smart infrastructure and transport, investing in new technology and big data to prepare and respond better to disasters, conserving and protecting our oceans. Part of this transformation have started to take shape. Countries are working on their national roadmap for SDG 7, increasing the share of renewable energy in their energy mix, switching to the use of clean cooking fuels, strengthening regional cooperation for sustainable oceans. We now look to the SDG Moment to set course for the future, one that is inclusive, gender equal, and green.
The Arab region registers the highest temperatures on record, reaching 55 degrees, with 5 more expected by the end of this century. Water and land resources are already strained. Nearly 87 million people lack access to drinking water. The region has already committed to increasing the share of renewable energy in its energy mix and needs to adopt integrated water management policies. However, financing remains a challenge. Exploring new financing means, such as debt for climate swap, is an option. Now is the time to integrate climate action into national planning. People cannot wait, and the planet cannot wait. Accelerating SDG implementation is our way forward.
With its high material footprint, the UNECE region must make its resource use more sustainable. Recovery packages must mobilize investments for the future, fully aligned with the green transformation needed to address climate change.
The region generates some 40% of GDP, but only 1/3 of global CO2 emissions. This shows the region has made some progress towards decarbonizing its economy. The region must further reduce energy use. Buildings' energy needs produce 40% of CO2 emissions. Improving building energy efficiency can deliver massive climate gains and create millions of jobs. Countries must reduce their dependence on fossil fuels and accelerate investment in renewables and low-carbon technologies. As we enter the last 10 years of Agenda 2030, I invite all governments to work with us to make the circular economy a reality.
Our region contributes only with 8.3% of global emissions, yet is highly vulnerable to climate change. Climate action should be the driving force to recover and build back better with job-intensive and carbon-free investments. Our region pledged a collective target of 70% renewable energy by 2030. Investment in renewable energy sources jumped 65%. In Brazil, expansion of wind power mobilized 8.2 million and created 250,000 jobs. Costa Rica, Chile, and Uruguay committed to become carbon neutral in 2050. ECLAC is advocating for debt reduction for resilience in the Caribbean and the creation of a Caribbean resilience for adaptation. In Latin America and the Caribbean, building back better means reshaping development with equality and sustainability.
Over 3 to 5% of Africa's GDP is lost because of climate change. There are two areas where Africa can contribute to the reduction of CO2 emissions. The first is agriculture. The second is energy. In agriculture, two policies that we can put in place. The first is reduce extensive agriculture, do more intensive agriculture, but increase productivity, which will increase yields. Add an additional $100 billion to the economy and create 40 million jobs. In energy, Africa today is clearly energy deficient. Over half of our population does not have access to energy. More importantly, industry does not have access to make it competitive and trade globally. Therefore, we will need to produce more energy. Africa has 22,000 megawatts in its national determined contributions. We hope to find financing to do that. That is why Africa is asking for $100 billion to help it get out of the COVID crisis, and special drawing rights to help ensure that we can continue to finance the private sector to ensure that Africa grows back better from the crisis.
Coming out from this pandemic greener will require immense political will. The 2030 Agenda must be our blueprint for our collective action.
Certainly a sobering assessment. The imperatives are really clear, and to reiterate what the narrator there said and the SG said earlier is that we need greater political will. We hope the heads of state and government are watching. If you've just joined us, this is the 2020 SDG Moment. A warm welcome to our viewers from around the world. We now know that from a global perspective, we are moving too slowly to achieve the goals by 2030, and that there are varied but considerable challenges in each and every region. At the same time, our last two presentations also echoed the words of the Secretary General: transformative change is possible. Let's turn now to a presentation about the kind of interventions that are urgently needed to bring about that transformation, based not on theory, but on smart policies and actions that are being advanced by governments and stakeholders around the world. I now have the pleasure to introduce an interactive presentation by the leaders of three key entities of the UN Development System, the administrator of the UN Development Programme, and the executive directors of UN Women and the UN Environment Programme.
A crisis can change the world from one day to the next with tragic consequences. The choices countries make today can lay the foundations for a better future. COVID-19 demonstrates that bold choices and action, which seemed unthinkable before, are possible. We have unique opportunity to transition towards a fair, equitable, and sustainable future. This means tackling poverty and inequality, climate change, and strengthening gender equality, which also sits at the heart of the 2030 Agenda. Inequality is exacerbated by COVID-19. 96 million people are at risk of falling into extreme poverty, widening the gender poverty gap. Critical investments in social protection can help the 4 billion people without access to be more resilient to the effects of the pandemic. Climate change is a threat multiplier, disproportionately affecting the poor. 24.9 million people were forcibly displaced across 140 countries in 2019 because of nearly 1,900 mostly climate-related disasters. They are counting on collective action through Paris Agreement to reverse greenhouse gas emissions. Countries with higher female parliamentary representation are more likely to sign environmental treaties. When women are involved in peace processes, the agreements are more inclusive and durable. But change is too slow. At the current rate of progress, it will take 100 years to close the gender equality gap. Governments and partners have choices that, if correctly combined for the context of each country or group, can translate into a lifelong investment in equality and sustainability. Making those choices starts with commitment to tackling the complexity of human development.
Excellencies, Secretary General, Deputy Secretary General, it's good to be here with you in our UN headquarters, speaking live to the world about this SDG moment. The 2030 Agenda is a universal agenda for humanity, guided by the vision, or as Ola said, our imagination of a sustainable and fair world. But change, as the animation lays out, has been too slow. And now COVID-19 has exposed the implications of tattered safety nets, gender inequalities, and disregard for our planet. The pandemic is a clear warning. Recovery from crisis cannot be driven by a zero-sum game of economy versus environment or health versus economy. Rather, this once-in-a-generation chance to set things straight. And I'm hopeful that this ambition will be met. Over the next 10 minutes, we will tell you a story of what it means to leave no one behind, to put the dignity of every person at the center of building just, sustainable societies and economies. The pandemic is compressing the time it takes to make incredible progress in the face of terrible adversity. And it is shining a light on what has to be done. Together with my dear colleagues Phumzile and Inga, we will explore the courageous choices and policy innovations countries are making right now across the world to tackle the systemic challenges of poverty and inequality, gender inequality, and climate change. Advancing human development means creating opportunities for people through jobs and sustainable economies, but also eradicating the multiple dimensions of poverty and reducing inequality. To achieve this, social protection is an important investment, creating access for everyone to quality basic services, including universal health care. Before COVID, approximately 4 billion, yes, 4 billion people did not have access to social protection. Building people's resilience against vulnerability, risk, and deprivation, and helping them to get on their feet if they falter, defines social protection in the 21st century. This is crucially important given the expected reversal in human development for this year. Consider Colombia. Over the last 20 years, Colombia implemented an integrated social protection system, and it has delivered one of the fastest reductions in multidimensional poverty in the world. When COVID-19 hit, Colombia nearly doubled the number of households receiving social protection benefits in a matter of months. They did so by harnessing the power of digital platforms and modernized financial regulations. The results are expected to mitigate an increase in poverty by almost 5 percentage points. Colombia is not alone in scaling up these innovations. Togo, for example, built a digital cash transfer program from scratch in just 10 days. It now serves 12% of the country's population. Pakistan expanded an existing social protection program by 16 million households, and it now benefits almost half of the country's population. 3 things help drive action on social protection. First, go beyond income, to understand who to target, to know who is suffering most or risks falling into poverty. Second, create fiscal space to invest in social protection. And as UNDP found, a 6-month temporary basic income would require only 1/3 of what developing countries owe in external debt payments just in this year 2020. Creating fiscal space also means phasing out expenditures that no longer make sense, like fossil fuel subsidies, as my colleague Inga will speak to in a moment. And third, make digital the default. The pandemic has shown the power of digital solutions to scale quickly, but also the urgent need to close the digital divide that still affects half the world's population. From expanding social protection to upending gender social norms, as my colleague Phumzile will speak to next, social protection is an opportunity for generational change. Thank you.
Thank you, Akim. This year marks the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action. As we celebrate this landmark agreement, COVID-19 threatens to undo the gains made on gender equality over the past 25 years. Women's economic security is in jeopardy. Gender poverty gaps are widening. Gender-based violence is resurgent, and girls' education and maternal health are threatened. In 2021, it is expected there will be 118 women in poverty for every 100 poor men globally, and this could rise by 2030. This would be a stunning reversal for the SDGs. But this kind of backsliding is not a foregone conclusion. With bold policies to boost women's economic empowerment, we can shift costs and accelerate progress instead, whether it is through policies to increase women's employment, including to support skills development and gender equality in science, technology, and innovation, services to support care to reduce women's load or to respond to violence. Countries recognize women's potential and are showing the way. In 2015, Uruguay put in place a publicly financed comprehensive care system for children, the elderly, and people with disabilities. As a result, Uruguay is today one of the leading countries in childcare provision and employment rates for mothers. There are other examples. Georgia and South Africa are supporting women's businesses. Morocco is assisting women's cooperatives. Japan and Sweden have policies to promote equal pay. In Australia, the government is leading the way to boost women's equality in STEM. The UN system is taking these policy insights to support countries on similar pathways. Societies benefit when women can rise to opportunities. A profound transformation of economies is required for a just, sustainable future where women are at the centers. Countries need to invest in care services, education, and skills that will be a backbone of the economies of the future. My colleague, Inga Anderson, will explore the climate action investments needed to transition from a gray to a green economy.
Thank you, Phumzile, and thank you, Akim. Climate action will help achieve multiple goals across the 2030 agenda. The NDCs are at the very heart of translating climate ambition into action. As we mark 5 years of Agenda 2030, we are contending with the warmest climates on Earth. We cannot afford a future powered by fossil fuels, which are the largest single contributors to climate change. We committed in Paris to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees centigrade. But projections show that by 2030, we will produce 120% more fossil fuel. This dangerous path could see us double emissions by 2050. As countries construct the response plans, they cannot afford to take their eyes off the relationship between people and planet. As we phase out fossil fuels, we need clean and sustainable sources of energy. Renewable energy is part of the solution, and we are making progress around the world. South Africa invested $20 billion in renewable energy over the last 8 years. Renewable energy creates jobs. It could create 42 million jobs by 2050, with higher gender parity as compared to traditional energy sectors. And nature's infrastructure holds answers too, to sustainable, inclusive recovery that drives down poverty and upends gender inequalities. Consider the Sahel. Bordering the Sahara Desert, the Sahel is on the front lines of the climate crisis. The ambitious Great Green Wall, a collaboration from Senegal to Djibouti, contributes to 15 of the 17 SDGs. It's restoring ecosystems, accelerating growth and jobs, and combating climate change. The Secretary General has set out 6 steps for climate action. We need to phase out fossil fuel subsidies, redirect finance from nature negative into nature positive flows, invest in renewables, and as we phase out fossil fuels, we need clean and sustainable sources of energy. We need to invest in nature. Excellencies, COVID-19 is a challenge of our lifetimes, but it is also an opportunity to correct conditions that brought us here. A green, inclusive recovery provides a policy space to make long overdue changes to our socioeconomic architecture and to rebalance our relationship with the environment. We must head off the long-term consequences of digital exclusion, including for the millions of children who are left without access to online education. We must offer decent jobs that also protect our natural assets, especially for our young people who will bear the burden or the fruit of the choices that we make today. We must rely on international cooperation and frameworks to steer our paths, and we must do whatever it takes to contain the virus without taking our eyes off the future we want. The world was ill-prepared to confront the devastating effects of COVID-19. We're not here today because of the virus. We're here in spite of it. Our choices matter. This is our decade of transformation.
Thank you to all our presenters of the last segment and for the animators and producers behind the amazing visualizations. We have heard that progress has been made, but we have so much more to do. We have seen the possibilities that lie ahead, and we know that to grasp them, we need to make bold choices. In the next segment, we will hear directly from heads of state and government and the leaders of regional organizations about the gaps they face in their SDG implementation to accelerate progress over the coming decade. To begin, we will hear from the person who presides over the global town hall of our global village and the ultimate home of the 2030 Agenda. I have the great honor to introduce His Excellency Mr. Volkan Bozkir, President of the 75th session, the historic 75th session of the UN General Assembly. Mr. President, sir, you have the floor.
His Excellency Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, His Excellency Ms. Amina Mohammed, Deputy Secretary General, His Excellency Ambassador Munir Akram, President of ECOSOC. Excellencies, I'm honored to address you all today at this inaugural SDG moment. When mandated by the General Assembly, few of us could have known the setbacks the pandemic would cause the SDGs and the urgency that this would present us today. In less than a year, we have seen social and economic damage on a scale not seen since the Second World War. At least 71 million people are being pushed into extreme poverty. Approximately 270 million people face acute food insecurity. And an estimated 1.6 billion children and youth have seen their education threatened. Allow me to be frank. Progress on the SDGs was inconsistent and, of course, well before COVID-19 shook the world. The pandemic has unveiled the dangers inherent in today. It has reminded us starkly of the need to act. Not since the United Nations was founded has the world required such levels of collaboration, cooperation, and dialogue. These are the moments for which we were built. It is for this reason that I have included the SDGs and Decade of Action amongst the priorities of the 75th session. Halting to the spread of COVID-19 and regaining progress against the SDGs must be our collective priority. Countries in special situations, including the least developed countries, should be prioritized. It will not be easy, but the SDGs themselves provide us the very blueprint needed to recover better. We must look to 2020 with renewed vigor. The pandemic may have set us back, but it can also be the board from which we bounce back further and faster. As countries across the globe embark upon socio-economic recovery plans, let them be guided by the SDGs. Let us choose a more equal, more green, more resilient world. On this, I'm confident that UNDP and the broader UN system, under the guidance of the Deputy Secretary General, are accelerating efforts at the national level. As I open this segment on SDG gaps and plans, I urge heads of state and governments to share the plans and measures to innovate and inspire greater action through transformative pathways over the course of the decade. I support the efforts of the Secretary General in the reform agenda and appreciate the timely and far-reaching reforms of the United Nations development system. UN country teams are key players in this crucial effort and must continue to support national efforts and priorities, particularly around COVID recovery and the SDGs. The Decade of Action may have started with a global emergency and a dramatic setback, but we can choose to let this strengthen our resolve. We can choose to go forward with unwavering ambition to achieve the SDGs while overcoming the COVID-19 pandemic. Let this be the moment that we make the choice. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President, and good luck as you preside over what will be a historic virtual UN 75 high-level week next week. Regional cooperation between countries has proven to be a critical driver of peace and prosperity over the last 75 years. In this spirit, we will now hear from the leader of the Secretariat of one of the crucial regional organizations, His Excellency, Mr. Musa Faki Mahamat, Chairperson of the African Union Commission.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, heads of state and government, Secretary General of the United Nations, the President of the General Assembly of the United Nations, distinguished guests. The year 2020 marked the beginning of the Decade of Action and the decade for the implementation of the SDGs. This was launched by the leaders of the world during the UNGA, held to do just that. We're also at the beginning of the decade which must elapse before the deadline for the achievement of the SDGs in 2030. So we're 3 years before the end of the first 10-year-long plan for the implementation of the African Union Agenda, Agenda 2063. After 2 decades of sustained economic growth and of significant improvement in all social sectors, the continent was on the right path to ultimately transform its impressive economic gains into fruit that could allow it to achieve the SDGs and see those achieved across the world. Indeed, the continent was getting ready to take the ideal measures to render operational the African Free Trade Area and to step up the pace of implementation of Agenda 63 and the SDG agenda. However, this momentum was broken by the eruption of the most deadly pandemic that the world has ever witnessed. What began as a simple health crisis quickly mutated into one of the worst economic, social and humanitarian crises, and is in the midst of undoing all of the significant economic progress achieved thus far. Since the very beginning of the appearance of COVID-19 in Africa, the African Union created a COVID-19 response fund and convened several high-level meetings. There was a heads of government and head of regional economic commissions conference. There was a conference with the ministers of finance, employment and agriculture, and all of these stakeholders worked together to better coordinate the continent's strategy to respond to the pandemic and the continent's strategy in terms of resource mobilization. Africa also implemented a panel of special envoys to aid countries in their efforts to negotiate the treatment of African debt and the relief of African debt, as well as the mobilization of resources, both domestic and external. However, these efforts remain limited given the scope of havoc wreaked by the pandemic. In this regard, world solidarity is vital. The pandemic is a global challenge, and consequently, the whole world must work together as closely as it possibly can. We now, in the form of the pandemic, have a historic opportunity to build back better and restore the strength of the value of multilateralism. Africa has also witnessed the pandemic as an opportunity to transform a crisis into an opportunity. It's reshaped its development model, diversified its economies, and made them more resilient to exogenous shocks. The structural diversification of economies through the transformation of productive spheres has been one thing Africa's done. Africa's also added value to its value change and ushered in digitization. All of these endeavours should better enable Africa to harness greater benefits from African free trade areas. The implementation of these FDAs should increase intra-African trade to the tune of 15% and should produce between $15 and $20 billion in the near future. It should step up economic growth and create a number of jobs, including and particularly for young people and women. It should also step up the pace of sustainable development. The African Union calls for more solidarity, more equity, more justice, more humanity, so that together we can build a better world for us all. Thank you for your kind attention.
I thank the leader of the African Union Commission. Unlike its predecessor, the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals apply universally because people are being left behind in every country, and because development is a constant process of change and improvement. Over the course of the next 90 minutes, we will hear from 23 countries across different regions. What we will see are the unique circumstances, starting points, and contexts in which each country finds itself. But we will also see a range of common and shared regional and global challenges. We will begin with 6 countries from across Africa. We have heard about the trends in poverty reduction, climate, and gender equality in Africa, from slowdown in poverty trends and economic growth to the existential threats of climate change. We will now learn how these trends translate into specific challenges of a group of countries from the region and the plans that these countries have put in place to address them. I invite you now to listen to the statements from the distinguished heads of state and government from Angola, Botswana, Nigeria, Seychelles, my country, South Africa, and Morocco.
Excelência, Senhor Secretário-Geral das Nações Unidas, Excelência, Senhor Chefe de Estado e de Governo, minhas senhoras e meus senhores. Saúdo todos os presentes com votos de muito boa saúde, principalmente no momento que o mundo vive uma profunda crise econômica, financeira e social provocada pela pandemia da Covid-19. O governo de Angola reafirma o seu compromisso de trabalhar pelos 17 Objetivos do Desenvolvimento Sustentável no quadro da Agenda 2030, intitulada Transformar o Nosso Mundo, para que os mesmos sejam alcançados no nosso país, com particular realce para a eliminação da pobreza extrema e a redução significativa dos níveis de pobreza multidimensionais até ao ano 2030. O primeiro objetivo do desenvolvimento sustentável foi definido como sendo a erradicação da pobreza, facto que ganha muito mais importância depois dos fundamentos da economia mundial terem sido fortemente abalados por este forte choque negativo provocado pela pandemia da Covid-19. O governo de Angola atribui uma grande importância às questões relativas ao combate à pobreza e à elevação do bem-estar e da qualidade de vida das populações. Por esta razão, dos 70 programas de ação que integram o Plano de Desenvolvimento Nacional de Angola para o período 2018-2022, 36 têm incidência sobre a meta da eliminação da pobreza extrema e da redução da pobreza multidimensional. Estes programas de combate à pobreza estão definidos com base nos seguintes eixos de atuação: as transferências monetárias, a inclusão produtiva ou geração de trabalho e renda, a ampliação das infraestruturas e da oferta de bens, a ampliação dos serviços sociais com destaque para a alfabetização, o ensino e a saúde, e o reforço da capacidade institucional, sobretudo no domínio da assistência social às crianças, às mulheres, aos jovens e aos idosos. Gostaríamos de destacar o início, a 30 de maio do corrente ano, da implementação de um programa de transferências sociais monetárias que irá abranger 1.600.000 famílias. Este programa, em parceria com o Banco Mundial e que se estenderá até o ano 2022, inclui um pacote financeiro equivalente a 420 milhões de dólares americanos. Numa altura em que, devido a restrições orçamentais e financeiras, a função pública em Angola não está a admitir novos agentes, aumentamos consideravelmente o número de profissionais nos setores da saúde e da educação. Foram abertas mais de 19.000 vagas para professores do ensino geral em 2018 e cerca de 10.000 vagas em 2019, totalizando mais de 29.000 vagas para o sistema de ensino geral só nos últimos 2 anos. No setor da saúde, foram abertas cerca de 7.600 vagas em 2018, enquanto que em 2019 foram abertas 7.000 vagas, prefazendo um total de 14.600 profissionais de saúde. No domínio das infraestruturas para o Sistema Nacional de Saúde, o nosso país fez um importante investimento nos últimos 2 anos, tendo aumentado o número de camas disponíveis nos hospitais em 5.382 unidades. Foram inaugurados novos hospitais em várias localidades do país, aumentando-se assim a oferta dos cuidados intensivos de saúde. Tendo em conta a sua grande importância na economia de Angola, a produção alimentar familiar constitui um pilar de enorme relevância nos esforços do governo de Angola de combate à pobreza.
Mr. President, let me start by echoing Botswana's appreciation for the convening of this high-level event, dubbed the SDG Moment. We find this initiative opportune as it has great potential to provide sustained impetus for SDGs implementation during this decade of action. Botswana, like many other countries, has been negatively affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, which came at a time when my government had just set out a transformative development agenda in line with the 2030 agenda to propel Botswana to greater heights. The unstable global economy has caused disruptions and fiscal constraints that exacerbated the existing national budget deficit. Our worsened fiscal position will curtail efforts geared towards SDG 8, decent work and economic growth. This could ignite negative ripple effects on the country's performance of other SDGs, given the interlinkages. It is indisputable that our ongoing efforts to develop high multiplier effects in job creation run the risk of being reversed by the impact of COVID-19. The small, medium, and micro enterprises are the hardest hit, as they lack the resilience to deal with the effects of the pandemic. Consequently, the purchasing power of households has been eroded, leaving many families looking up to government for assistance. Mr. President, Botswana, with her limited resources, has come up with a short-term COVID-19 economic relief package to support the economy and complement disease containment measures. The package covers interventions such as additional health expenditure, deferment of corporate tax on profit payable by firms, and a loan guarantee scheme to support access to bank credit by affected firms. Moreover, non-fiscal measures adopted include easing the monetary policy and introduction of additional liquidity measures for commercial banks to enable them to support economic activity. Botswana has also developed an economic recovery and transformation plan, which will complement the short-term economic relief package. Mr. President, my government is committed to closing implementation gaps to turn the COVID-19 crisis into a catalyst towards achieving the SDGs. As such, we have collaborated with the UN team in Botswana to develop comprehensive SDGs planning guidelines. The government will also develop an SDG financing strategy and its core institutional components through the design and implementation of an integrated national financing framework. This will strategically position Botswana to identify and leverage domestic and international public and private finance to support the realization of national priorities and SDGs. Botswana intends to collaborate with the international community to apply advanced Fourth Industrial Revolution technologies towards the implementation of her development agenda. Another expected impact is efficiency in spending, cost containment, and avoidance of wastage to effectively deliver public services within the public sector. Mr. President, let me conclude by reaffirming Botswana's commitment and readiness to doing her part towards implementation of our internationally agreed development goals, aimed at leaving no man, woman, or child behind. We thus remain steadfast and determined to build back better and faster. Thank you for your attention.
President of the General Assembly, Secretary General of the United Nations, Excellencies, Heads of State and Government, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the government and people of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, I congratulate Your Excellency Volkan Bozkır on your election as President of the 75th session of the United Nations General Assembly. I would also like to congratulate His Excellency Antonio Guterres, the United Nations Secretary General, for convening the maiden edition of the Sustainable Development Goals Moment. Nigeria is delighted to be part of this event, which affords us the opportunity as global leaders to reinforce our dedication to achieving the SDGs. I therefore commend the Secretary General for taking steps to place the decade of action on SDGs at the center of the crucial high-level week of the 75th session of the United Nations General Assembly. Excellencies, Nigeria has made good strides in sustainable development goals, domestication processes, as we have commenced the realignment of the national statistical system with the requirements and indicators of the Sustainable Development Goals. We have developed a novel homegrown integrated Sustainable Development Goals model as an analytical framework for assessing how policy making can better address the indivisible nature of the Sustainable Development Goals. Nigeria has also set up a model private sector advisory group and an SDGs donors forum with a view to engaging critical stakeholders toward the attainment of the SDGs. I wish to recall that Nigeria presented its second voluntary national review on the Sustainable Development Goals to the United Nations High-Level Political Forum in July 2020. The second voluntary national review highlighted our efforts to meet Sustainable Development Goals targets on the critical issues of poverty and an inclusive economy, health and well-being, education and gender equality, enabling environment of peace and security, and partnerships. This was based on our current development priorities as captured in our Economic Recovery and Growth Plan 2017 to 2020, as well as our medium-term National Development Plan 2020 to 2025. Nigeria is also committed to mainstreaming the Sustainable Development Goals into our subsequent development plans. In this decade of action, Nigeria will implement unique initiatives aimed at accelerating the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Such initiatives include the realigned national statistical system to effectively track and monitor the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals on an annual basis. The Nigeria Integrated Sustainable Development Goals simulation model to support the domestication of the planning model across the 36 states, the integrated national financing frameworks for the Sustainable Development Goals, the scaled-up National Social Investments Program to reach more poor and vulnerable Nigerians in line with our commitment to lift 100 million people out of poverty within a 10-year period, and the engaging of all segments of the society for the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Similarly, our National Assembly has established committees on Sustainable Development Goals. The National Youth Service Scheme is also ensuring that Nigerian graduates actively participate in the Sustainable Development Goals implementation processes by serving as SDGs champions at the grassroots. In addition, we have also strengthened our anti-corruption institutions to enable us more effectively combat illicit financial flows and recover its proceeds. Excellencies, in line with our administration's priority, Nigeria inaugurated the Total Official Support for Sustainable Development Task Force team in July 2017. The team was saddled with the responsibility of developing a new framework for measuring officially supported resources for the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. However, the coronavirus pandemic has altered our socio-economic dynamics and threatened to derail our progress on achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. To address this, we have rededicated efforts towards diversifying our economy, focusing on agriculture and the mining sectors. Having observed that policy incoherence and trade-offs pose significant challenge to us, we will pay greater attention to interlinkages and mainstream sustainability assessment into the annual cycle of our policy planning, as well as budgeting and the reporting processes. Going forward, we will invigorate the goal achievement process as a grassroots by engaging the services of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals ambassadors we appointed to support our efforts at the national level. We will also encourage more subnational authorities to appoint and train Sustainable Development Goals champions. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, let me conclude by reaffirming Nigeria's commitment to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and other internationally agreed development goals. You can count on the support of our administration in our collective quest to achieve these noble objectives. Thank you.
Dear honorable delegates, ladies and gentlemen, this first annual SDG Moment is a rallying call for us all. The SDGs unite us around a shared future threatened not only by COVID-19, but by the existential threat of climate change. This shared future is about more than just socio-economic progress. It is about saving lives. Last month, Seychelles celebrated the 250th anniversary of its settlement. Over these 2.5 centuries, a nation has been forged from a melting pot of continents, from the pain of slavery. A nation has been built on the spirit of unity in diversity. This is what Seychelles stands for. A small island developing state, conscious of our isolation, but also aware of our potential, a large ocean nation. Today, the fruits of our labor speak for themselves. The Republic of Seychelles presented its very first voluntary national review in July of this year as its blueprint for SDG implementation. Our successes were notable in areas such as education, health, as well as in environmental protection and conservation. As an island nation, we are inherently vulnerable to external shocks. Climate change underlines this vulnerability, coupled with a narrow resource base and associated challenges of resource mobilization, human resource constraints, and regional maritime security risk. While we have led the way in responding to COVID-19 with no cases of local transmission, the economic impact has been dramatic. For Seychelles, this has meant foregoing some of the hard-fought economic gains and adopting contingency plans focused on protecting our population. This is our foremost priority. I urge all our partners to review criteria currently being used to measure development and ensure that an appropriate focus on vulnerability is captured. The SDGs require us to look beyond GDP. They require us to invest in well-being of citizens. There is no better time in this decade of action to adopt a vulnerability index that can allow us to better target resources for development. The interrelatedness of the SDGs will mean that the COVID-19 pandemic will have systemic effects on our performance in almost all the goals. With an economy heavily reliant on tourism and services, the pandemic has dealt a blow to the livelihoods of thousands. As a global collective, we must also turn to nature to find solutions to the problems we face. In accelerating our economic development, we acknowledge the vast potential of the ocean and the blue economy as catalysts of transformative economic growth through which we all can benefit. We must recognize the true value of our natural capital to fight climate change. Seychelles' decision to protect over 1/3 of its exclusive economic zone is driven by the recognition that we all have a responsibility to solve this problem. In doing so, we will also create new economic opportunities that are anchored in the protection of nature. We need to turn the same urgency of response to COVID-19 to tackle climate change. In the teeth of the crisis created by COVID-19, we are proceeding with remedial policy responses, which will contribute towards bringing Seychelles back on track to achieving the SDGs. In March of this year, the government launched a flagship initiative, the Financial Assistance for Job Retention Scheme, which is catering for the salaries of businesses hardest hit by the adverse effects of COVID-19. A nation such as ours does not have unlimited resources to inject into the response to COVID-19. While we seek to diversify, we do not have a million options to choose from. However, we are determined to protect our people. We are determined to make this decade of action meaningful. Today's reality has put all of us to the test, and in the true Seychelles spirit, the people of Seychelles have risen to the occasion. My fellow SDG champions, despite the threat of the pandemic, we must remain focused on our journey to forge our way towards a brighter, more equitable, and sustainable future. Let us work together with unwavering resolve, leaving no one behind. I thank you.
Secretary General, Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, South Africa welcomes this opportunity to engage on accelerated global action towards sustainable development. As we do so, we face the reality that the immense resources we have directed to fighting the coronavirus pandemic have severely set back our ability to realize the Sustainable Development Goals. At the same time, this is an unprecedented opportunity to build back better and fairer. For Africa, the path we must take is clear. The UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is a lodestar for transforming our world and the template for global cooperation and partnership. We must invest in our people. We must provide developing countries with the means to achieve the SDGs. We must ensure technology transfer and capacity building support. We must ensure that no country is left behind. We must also prioritize those countries with special needs and circumstances, including least developed countries, small island developing states, and countries in conflict or under occupation. Regrettably, the multilateral response to advancing sustainable development has experienced setbacks on many fronts. This has been in no small part due to the impact of the pandemic. Some countries have reneged on their multilateral commitments. It is our hope that member states will find common cause in this ambitious, forward-looking, and truly transformative global agenda. Our experience with COVID-19 has really demonstrated what can be achieved if we act and work together to address global challenges. In the face of the pandemic, African countries have acted with determination and resolve. The African Union is developing a comprehensive response to COVID-19, addressing the economic and social and environmental pillars of sustainable development, working together as countries, as the international community, and with our development partners, it is within our means to meet the aspirations of Agenda 2030. It is within our means to eradicate poverty and inequality and to bring about greater economic justice and conserve our natural world for future generations. I thank you.
In the name of God, the merciful and all compassionate. Secretary-General of the United Nations, Excellencies, I would like to thank the Secretary-General for having convened this high-level meeting on the SDGs. This comes at an important time because we need to assess progress made in the implementation of these SDGs, and we also need to explore the ways and means of creating new impetus to implement them. This is a necessity imposed by the COVID-19 pandemic, which caused a socioeconomic and health crisis which is unprecedented and has made millions of human beings even more vulnerable. This crisis has also made the implementation of the SDGs more difficult. It has also, however, demonstrated the relevance of the Agenda 2030 and the centrality of the goals linked to health and social protection. Excellencies, the Kingdom of Morocco has made the SDGs a national priority. Recently, we submitted our second voluntary national review to the high-level political forum. In this report, we presented tangible progress made by Morocco in the following fields: access to basic services, fight against poverty, reduction of social inequality, women's empowerment, and investment in human capital and renewable energy. However, COVID-19 has had a serious impact on socio-economic development in Morocco, much like other countries around the world. So that we can fight against the repercussions of this pandemic, Morocco, under the directives of His Royal Highness Mohammed VI, a whole raft of measures, including a special fund to fight against the effects of the pandemic, strengthening the healthcare system, and providing the necessary support to the most vulnerable strata of society, as well as supporting the most affected businesses. On the Throne Festival in July 2020, His Royal Highness Mohammed VI presented a plan which is underpinned by the following points. It is for economic recovery, to inject the equivalent of $12 billion into the national economy, to create an investment fund to support the essential productive sectors, as well as the provision of universal health coverage. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the Kingdom of Morocco, under the wise leadership of His Royal Highness, continue to meet its commitments to strengthen national development as in part of our partnerships, which keeps Africa at the heart of its concerns. In conclusion, we would also like to pay all necessary attention to Africa to strengthen its immunity against this crisis. And we also called on the United Nations to create a special fund to support the implementation of the SDGs in Africa. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished heads of state and government from Angola, Botswana, Nigeria, the Seychelles, South Africa, and Morocco. Next, we will hear from countries in the Asia and Pacific regions. From the megacities and successful development stories to the challenges of small island development states and the complexities of migration and conflict, the next group of countries are searching for a more inclusive and sustainable path and determined to overcome adversities. I invite you to listen now to the statements from the distinguished heads of state and government of Lebanon, Palau, Nepal, and Samoa.
في سبيل على أصحاب السعادة أتوجه.
Your Excellencies, I would like to thank you for organising this conference. It is the first as part of the action plan for the coming 10 years, in view of achieving the 17 Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. These goals to which our peoples aspire and to which Lebanon renews its commitment, despite the dire circumstances that the country is currently going through. Our aim is to work for a better world for all of us and for this generation and generations to come. Undoubtedly, our world is today facing tremendous challenges that affect our countries in different ways. Notably, Lebanon has been shaken by multiple tremors, first and foremost from the massive Syrian crisis that has been lingering for 10 years now, and at thrusting upon us a pressing development reality. In the middle of our fight against the COVID-19 pandemic, Lebanon was struck by an enormous explosion at the heart of the capital, causing huge human and physical damages and tremendous adverse effects on all economic sectors. This also led to an increase in the poverty rates. I would like to thank our friends in different countries and different international organizations who have provided full support to Lebanon, providing economic and humanitarian assistance and in helping us address this challenge, this tragedy. I'd like to draw your opportunity to the fact that all the challenges faced by Lebanon have affected our priorities. And this is why it's become vital to, first and foremost, respond to the most pressing crises. This is indeed in line with the principle called for by the 2030 Agenda, namely, leaving no one behind, by delivering aid to the most in need and the poorest and the most marginalised, and those affected most in society. Secondly, our aim is to repair, and as soon as possible, the 200,000 residential units that were affected by the explosion. This caused the displacement of 300,000 citizens, and winter is also on the horizon. Third, we need to rebuild the port of Beirut. This is a vital artery of the Lebanese economy. To address the severe damages that have been affected, that have affected all sectors. These sectors include health, education, food, construction, and tourism, amongst others. Ladies and gentlemen, Lebanon stands today at a crucial intersection between, on the one hand, its aspiration to achieve the SDGs over the next decade, and on the other hand, to resolve the various crises, whether they be economic, financial, monetary, or social. We need, more than ever, further support from the international community and the United Nations organizations to help us overcome these new emergencies. For this, we need oriented action and close cooperation between us and the different UN bodies and governmental bodies, so that we can establish humanitarian aid programs to strengthen sustainable development and economic and social stability in order to address the problems of the present and to prepare ourselves for the various challenges of the future. I thank you.
Well, Excellencies, Ali from the Republic of Palau. 7 years ago, Pacific Island states were champions for the inclusion of a standalone sustainable development goal on oceans. It was a novel idea at the time and one which encountered substantial resistance. But for our islands and for the world, an agenda which did not recognize the critical role of healthy and resilient oceans to sustainable development could not meet the challenge of our times. The conservation and sustainable use of our marine resources shapes our efforts to end poverty, reduce inequality, and promote human dignity. This is no less true today. Indeed, it is even more important. Turning to the ocean also provides us with solutions for how we can recover development progress lost to this pandemic and how to set us on a new path towards realizing the 2030 Agenda. We hear talk of Build Back Better, and this cannot be mere lip service. We need to integrate healthy oceans and climate change into the architecture of development to build back bluer. 4 targets of Call 14 mature this year: unprotected areas, on fisheries subsidies, on ecosystem-based management, and on fishing within biological sustainable levels. But as a global community, we are not on track to meet them. Significant gaps in implementation remain. Significant gaps in support for developing countries and island circumstances remain. In Palau, we are making our contribution to the protected areas target through implementing the Palau National Marine Sanctuary, which began just a few months ago. But realizing the full potential of the sanctuary to develop an artisanal domestic fishing sector which supports jobs and improves access to nutritious seafood depends on partnerships, on strengthening existing partnerships and building new ones for technology, finance, and infrastructure. Our moment to draw upon ocean solutions in setting course for the decade of action is now. We hope that the Palau Sanctuary provides inspiration for biodiversity negotiations to set the minimal level of ocean ambition through a commitment to protect 30% of our ocean by 2030. And that it also provides inspiration for 100% of the ocean to be sustainably managed. In December, the high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy of 14 leaders will launch our recommendations for a transition towards a sustainable ocean economy. This will point to transformative actions that respond to the threats that the ocean faces, so that the ocean can support our sustainable development. As our decade of action begins, we must not leave the ocean behind. Only by doing this can we ensure that our people are not left behind. Kongmal Misulang, thank you very much.
Excellencies, the heads of state and government, UN Secretary General Mr. Antonio Guterres, distinguished delegates. At the outset, I would like to commend the Secretary General for convening this high-level event. We are meeting at a critical juncture. The COVID-19 pandemic has devastated livelihoods, disrupted economies, and distressed the public health and social security systems. Most importantly, as we embark on the decade of action and delivery of the 2030 Agenda, the pandemic has derailed the momentum of its implementation. The challenges have compounded and gaps have widened. However, this is not a moment to shift the goalpost further, nor is it a time to back off in despair. To navigate these turbulent times, the SDGs must serve as the compass of clarity. Excellencies, sustainable development is at the center of Nepal's development vision and priorities. It underpins our national aspiration of prosperous Nepal, happy Nepali. We have mainstreamed the SDGs into the national plans and programs. They are now being localized. Showcasing our progress in SDGs, we presented our second voluntary national review report in high-level political forum in July this year. We have made some significant achievements in key areas including poverty reduction, food security, education, gender equality, basic sanitation, and energy access. Our people have been enjoying fundamental rights and freedoms as enshrined in the Constitution. However, the challenges and gaps remain. The current health crisis threatens our hard-earned gains, pushing our plan to graduate from the LDC status in peril. This COVID-19 pandemic has affected the countries in a special situation such as LDCs, LLDCs, and SIDs disproportionately. Their freezing economy, shrinking revenue, increasing public expenditure, rising poverty, and unemployment have severe impact in the attainment of the SDGs. We welcome the global initiatives and support measures taken in response to COVID-19. But this is not enough. Aligning these support measures with the 2030 Agenda, Istanbul Programme of Action, Vienna Programme of Action, Addis Agenda, and the Paris Agreement is equally important. For this, there is an urgent need to accelerate action at all levels and by all stakeholders beyond rhetoric. Our message should be of a cautious hope to steer the decade of action as well as recovery with sustainability as its core. In conclusion, a renewed sense of urgency and accountability in our collective efforts is critical to build back better and to ensure that no one is left behind. Thank you.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the 2030 Agenda and its 17 goals is our whole of society plan of action to propel the work on a path towards a sustainable and resilient future. 5 years after their adoption, the implementation of the interrelated goals is more critical and demands more ambitious and accelerated action if we are to end poverty, survive pandemic, fight inequality, or reverse the existential threat posed by climate change. Samoa applauds the SDG Moment initiative and is pleased to be amongst the inaugural group of countries to launch the Decade of Action. Our commitment to the 2030 Agenda is underscored by our inclusion in the first group of countries to report on our progress on SDGs in 2016 with our second VNR presented in July this year. Overall, our reviews revealed both positive gains and some regressions in some targets. We have integrated the SDGs and other global priorities into our national development planning, both medium and long-term budgeting partnership arrangements, accountability processes, and in alignment with regional planning as well. Data collection and inclusive and effective shareholder engagement was improved. We are pleased with the progress made in linking SDG implementation efforts with our regional and international commitments, including the Paris Agreement, Samoa Pathway, the Pacific Framework for Regionalism, the Human Rights Disarmament, and Environmental Conventions. The linkages are essential to building on synergies and identifying the gaps for better prioritization of accelerated action and transformative pathway. For implementation, Nevertheless, we face persistent challenges of limited resources, administrative capacity, skills gaps in data analysis and management. Samoa supports member countries' requests to the multilateral system to consider all possible ways to lessen physical debt distressant, ensure enhanced resilience. The biggest challenge for Samoa is our increased vulnerability to external shocks, disasters, and emerging threats, such as health crisis. We are experiencing loss of hard-fought gains due to the 2019 measles epidemic and the ongoing COVID-19 situation. Samoa's ability to develop a strategic response will determine the achievement of many of the SDGs. We are using our second VNR findings to feed into our new 5-year strategy for development, inform the Samoa 2040 vision and our COVID-19 response. It will also feed into the implementation processes for our human rights treaties. Finally, government will continue to ensure strong and decisive leadership and strengthen our whole of society approach, including through job creation, well-funded education, and protection to women and girls. These are key to our decade of action to improve the quality of life for all by leaving no one behind. So forth.
I thank the distinguished heads of state and government of Lebanon, Palau, Samoa, Nepal for their intervention. And of course, if you've just joined us from where you're watching around the world, this is the 2020 SDG Moment. Welcome and thank you for joining us. Next, we move to countries in the Eastern Europe group to have a closer look at the texture at a country level of gender equalities, effective institutions, and broadening opportunities for younger populations. I invite you now to listen to the statements from the distinguished heads of state and government of Georgia, North Macedonia, Slovenia, and Bulgaria.
Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, the world is facing unprecedented threats in this year marking the United Nations 75th anniversary. The pandemic has affected every country on the globe, causing health, social, and economic breakdowns and exposing most the vulnerable and high-risk groups. Global, state, and local response to the COVID-19 pandemic varies in intensity, but the one direction that can unite our efforts in achieving stable progress remains more than ever the implementation of the SDGs. Hence, today's moment is a very timely initiative by the Secretary General in order to share and reconfirm our commitments. Georgia has managed one of the most successful responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. Timely measures proved to be effective, and we have been learning as we go along to adapt our measures and the society's response. This initial success has been possible because the entire country stood together. Citizens, government, parliament, health systems, civil society, political parties, and all international development partners. In accordance with the first goal of the SDGs, we have set as a priority to minimize the social and economic impact of COVID-19 on vulnerable and high-risk groups by providing support packages. To leave no one behind has remained and remains our top priority. The speed, flexibility, and generosity of our development partners have supported us to adapt rapidly to the challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. Georgia has been privileged to be among the first recipients of resources from the Secretary General's UN COVID-19 Response and Recovery Fund. Georgia's 4 strategic priorities: security, economic development and employment, education and human capital, and open governance remain in the core of our daily work, and we have twice already presented our voluntary national review for achieving the SDGs. A new 2021-2025 cooperation framework will be signed between Georgia and the UN family, focusing on one overarching priority: enhancing human well-being, capabilities, and social equality. Now is the time for the next steps, that we need to show that sustainable development provides equal opportunities and helps countries to move forward with a more sustainable, inclusive, gender-equal society and a green and resilient economy to protect hard-won progress. SDG 17, Global Partnership for Sustainable Development, needs to remain at the center of our mobilization, without an understanding that today's challenges are global and that the way out is through international cooperation and solidarity, we will not emerge stronger from this crisis. It is impossible for any single country to address alone the global pandemic. Even though the challenges we face may be huge, we shall overcome them by working together and by delivering for all. Thank you.
Distinguished Excellencies, I would like to thank the UN Secretary General for organizing this annual SDG Moment. It is an honor to be part of this debate, which comes at a very important yet uncertain time. The COVID-19 pandemic has had severe impact, not only on the economy, it has also changed our lives and habits beyond recognition. Nowadays, the need to focus on sustainable development is even more urgent, yet this complex task requires coordinated reforms and profound shift in how we design our societies. In 2015, we pledged to leave no one behind and agreed to implement the 2030 Agenda as adopted by UN member states. Our focus is on better life for all citizens, and our national efforts on sustainable development are also in line with our key foreign policy goal, joining the European Union. The rapid integration assessment of the SDGs conducted in 2019 found that 83% of national strategic development plans were aligned with the SDGs. Priority goals for 2019-2020 for North Macedonia are to end poverty, to provide inclusive and equitable quality education, to promote inclusive and sustainable economic growth and decent jobs for all, to take urgent actions to combat climate change, to ensure access to justice for all, and to build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. Climate change remains a challenge. At the Paris Summit in December 2015, the government committed to reducing emissions from fossil fuels by as much as 36% by 2030, compared with the baseline scenario. We have taken measures to produce clean, affordable, and secure energy, including increased use of solar energy. Air pollution remains a challenge for North Macedonia, and it requires long-term, systemic approach, investing in greener economy for greener environment. Equality before the law is a priority for us. We are committed to continue with structural reforms, strengthen the rule of law and judicial system that would be trusted by the majority of the citizens. In July 2020, we presented the first voluntary national review, which reflects on the achievements on the Agenda 2030 and identifies next steps to accelerate the implementation of the SDGs in the remaining decade of action. In drafting this document, we partnered with and are grateful for the contribution to the UN agencies in North Macedonia, youth organizations, civil society, academia, and chambers of commerce. Sustainable development is not just an additional plan for the world. The Agenda 2030 is an obligation to ours and future generations to fully utilize the human potential and consider the legacy we will leave behind. Thank you for your attention.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the 2030 Agenda offers a better future for billions of people around the world and for our planet as a whole. Slovenia was one of the first countries to incorporate sustainable development goals in the frame of its national priorities. We are committed to a transparent implementation of the agenda. That is why we presented voluntary national review already for the second time. I am happy to report that Slovenia has made progress in almost all of the 17 goals, in particular with regard to ending poverty in all its forms everywhere. Significant improvement has been made also in other areas, such as recycling and eco-farming. Slovenia ranks as a high-performing education system. Still, there are challenges ahead of us in the areas of labor market, circular economy, and climate neutrality. Slovenia, as we see it in 2030, is a green country of clean nature and many natural habitats. It is a society of knowledge, innovation, new technologies, with a high level of wealth and comfort. We believe that by working together for the sustainable transformation of Slovenia, we can make a key contribution to co-creating a better and fairer world. The so-called new normality caused by a pandemic of COVID-19 is bringing about major political, economic, and social changes. Its impact will be more powerful than the direct healthcare consequences. The COVID lesson is one of unity and solidarity. The pandemic has also forced us to become more creative, to think differently, to seek solutions where we have not before. The goals of Agenda 2030, although adopted in different eras, is an accurate answer to challenges of our time. Today, we have 10 years in front of the finish line. There is no time to waste. The moment is now. Thank you so much.
Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Agenda 2030 is of utmost importance to Bulgaria as a key to tackling poverty and inequality and as a means for achieving a prosperous, peaceful and inclusive society. Already in 2015, we made a long-term commitment to all 17 Sustainable Development Goals. There are only 10 years left for their implementation, and we need full mobilization on the side of the international community. The COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated that there is serious lag in the implementation of the SDGs. It has brought to the fore exacerbated social inequalities, poverty, the serious consequences of climate change. At the same time, the COVID-19 pandemic clearly showed that the 2030 Agenda is more relevant than ever. The declared decade of action will also be the decade of recovery. This is a chance for better recovery with a focus on achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. The COVID-19 pandemic has taught us that no country can do it alone. Close cooperation and coordinated action are needed. At the same time, we must all do our part, strictly adhering to the principle of no one left behind, and with the participation of all stakeholders. The engagement of the non-governmental sector, business, youth, academia, vulnerable groups and the local government is key to achieving the goals. This year, Bulgaria presented its first voluntary national review. Along with the achievements, we have identified some challenges to doing our part. There is a need to improve the quality of education and healthcare. Poverty and social exclusion continue to be a challenge. Better implementation of the legislation on environmental protection is also needed. We plan to set up a national coordination mechanism for the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals with the participation of the government and a wide range of stakeholders. The motto of the Bulgarian Parliament, United we stand strong, is fully valid with regard to the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. Bulgaria is ready to do its part. It's time for action.
Excellency. And increasing poverty are among the challenges that Latin America was facing before COVID-19. For the Caribbean small island developing states, issues of debt and the impacts of climate change represent topics of utmost concern. I invite you now to listen to the statements from the distinguished heads of state and government of Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and Barbados.
Looking ahead to 2030, Colombia committed to meeting the 17 goals in order to achieve sustained and orderly development, which was aimed at defeating extreme poverty across the planet. Our development plan, a Pact for Colombia, Pact for Equity, is aimed at bringing down inequalities and focusing our country to build sustainably and with equity. Unfortunately, the pandemic has reached all countries and will remain with us for a long time. And despite the forecast shrinking of 9.1% of Latin American GDP, we decided to act quickly. In order to reduce inequalities and eradicate poverty, the government has provided financial aid to more than 10 million families and has earmarked resources representing 11% of our GDP. Through this, we have implemented social measures such as the Families in Action Programme, Young People in Action Programme, and also assistance for older people. Moreover, for the first time in the history of the country, we've created an economic aid program directed towards 13 million Colombians that didn't previously receive state subsidies. Already, 1.3 million Colombians have access to drinking water and basic sanitation for the first time. In addition, during the pandemic, we've connected more than 300,000 homes to the public water system, and they didn't previously have that access. We are committed to strengthening the healthcare system, and for that reason, we doubled our number of intensive care beds in a record time. Today, Colombians have more than 10,000 beds and 6,000 new ventilators across the country. This represents 91% growth in our hospital's capacity and investment of $2.2 billion. During this time of very great difficulties, we've made progress in connectivity and also digital transformation across the country. We've been implementing medical assistance through technology. So far, we've provided 33 million medical appointments via this service. We've also connected 10,000 rural villages and towns to free internet 24/7. And in this way, we can guarantee that all students will have access to education by digital means and that physical distancing will not be an impediment to studying. We are committed to fighting climate change, to protecting biodiversity, and we have planted 35 million native trees across the country. Moreover, the consolidation of our policy of peace with equality, which generates stability for the 170 municipalities that were historically most affected by violence and poverty in the country, has been one of our priorities. Colombia's aim over the last few years, and particularly in this decade of action and results in favour of sustainable development, has been to close social gaps with a social policy based on sustained economic growth, the eradication of poverty, universal coverage and quality education, access to public services, and gender equality. Colombia continues to look ahead towards the future, committed, because we know that as a nation, building equity is building sustainable and legal peace. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome the initiative of holding this annual meeting to achieve the greatest yearning of mankind, peace, prosperity, and the well-being of millions around the world. Our duty is to promote the full implementation of the 2030 Agenda and to have a more healthy planet. In this sense, my government has been implementing our National Development Plan 2016 to 2021, which we have called Toda una vida, an entire lifetime. And over the last few years, it has garnered significant international renown. Its name says it all. We are protecting human beings from the moment of their conception until God decides to close their eyes. An entire lifetime. My country has twice put forward its voluntary national review, and I will now cite some indicators. For example, the gender wage gap fell by more than 8 percentage points to 2019. Maternal mortality for every 100,000 live births fell by 8 points up to 2018. The housing service has increased by 8%. We saw a rise from 70,000 to 75,000 in the number of persons with disabilities who have been included in the labour market. We saw increase in access to housing by 2%. We've obtained 1.8 billion in resources to face COVID-19. We've set spending limits, and we are handing over loans to restart production. In addition, 950,000 families received emerging protection benefits, just to cite some of the measures that we have implemented in a record time. However, all of this will be insufficient without solidarity, particularly the international solidarity. Today, we depend on multilateralism and cooperation in order to make progress towards universal health coverage and universal access to medicines and vaccines against COVID-19. Ecuador stands ready to tackle the effects of climate change, protect biodiversity, protect marine biodiversity, and ensure the sustainable use of oceans and seas, but also to fight drought, because socio-economic and other development should also be in harmonious relation with nature. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in this 75th anniversary of the UN, Ecuador renews its commitment to the 2030 Agenda, underpinned by multilateralism, international cooperation, and the principle of common, yes, but differentiated responsibilities. This includes the mobilization of funding and the strengthening of capacities, as well as technology transfers between all member countries. May we ensure that this anniversary that we are celebrating today strengthen our commitments to ensure that we can fight in favor of a better world. Thank you very much.
Gracias.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to begin by conveying to you my greetings and sending you the affection of the Peruvian people. We are living through a critical juncture for the planet, the effects of which are affecting the economy, employment, education, trade, and the majority of human activities. But we are looking optimistically towards the future, and our commitment to continue with the efforts to win this battle against the virus. The celebration of the 75th anniversary of the establishment of the United Nations and the beginning of the decade of action in favor of sustainable development falls as we face the most devastating crisis, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. However, at the same time, we remain focused on meeting the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, which serve as the roadmap that should guide our decisions at a national and international level. The nature of the pandemic, which is affecting almost everybody, requires global responses based on a strengthened and efficient multilateral system. In this regard, Peru deems it essential that through the United Nations, we make a reality the stated aim of ensuring that vaccines and treatments against COVID-19 are considered as global public goods. We are sure that that would contribute to ensuring that this competition for knowledge, which involves researchers, academics, governments, the pharmaceutical industry, philanthropists, and volunteers, can achieve results which will bring us all a collective benefit. Ensuring universal, timely, and equitable access to vaccines is in line with the commitment of the 2030 Agenda of leaving no one behind and prioritizing those most left behind. COVID-19 and its effects has made even starker inequalities, not only in healthcare, but also socioeconomic inequalities in many of our societies. It has also revealed the fragility of the progress that we had been making. This discussion reminds us that when we adopted the 2030 Agenda, we committed to transforming our world. In order to firmly promote this transformation in my country, we have put forward an agreement, a pact between Peruvian society and its state in our vision for Peru as we look ahead to 2050. This transformative aspiration guided the measures that we adopted not only to mitigate the impacts of the pandemic, but also to close our social gaps. our economic and social reactivation plan, which is one of the most ambitious in the history of the country, represents an impetus which is equivalent to 20% of our GDP, and this will lead to the strengthening of our health services, further subsidies for poor and vulnerable families, facilities so that smallholders and small businesses can continue their activities. It will also provide remote learning programs, among other things. Moreover, we have placed the Peru Pact within our national agreement, and we are working on defining 5 aspects. Firstly, building a unified health system. Secondly, guaranteeing quality education. Thirdly, promoting economic growth. Fourth, reforming our system for the administration of justice. 5, fighting, and significantly fighting poverty and extreme poverty. The pact will serve as a basis for our national development plan that I announced during the SDGs summit in September last year. Finally, it will fall to whoever takes over from me following the general elections that are being convened for April 2021 in accordance with our electoral calendar and constitutional mandate to continue forging ahead in a concerted manner towards achieving the sustainable development goals that Peru has committed to. Thank you very much.
Excelencia.
Excellencies, here I am in Caracas, Venezuela, standing up as the constitutional president of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. Together with our people, a heroic people that resists and vanquishes the most diverse attacks of the most powerful empire known by mankind. In this year, 2020, without doubt, we are seeing the development of what is a second wave of independence in the defense of our sovereignty, our natural resources, and our right to development. This is an heroic gesture put forward by an entire country that, despite problems and aggression, is today on the offensive, and that in order to achieve the 2030 agenda. The United States and its government has unsuccessfully purported to erode through criminal unilateral coercive measures, to erode our basis for social justice and to try to bring down our model of inclusion and justice that we have forged over time. The Bolivarian Revolution has made steps forward over the last 2 decades, and that in consolidating a system for social protection through the so-called missions. They are great social missions. A crucial part of the structure of family income, which, despite the challenges currently posed by the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic and financial blockades, stands firm and is being further consolidated. For example, we have clubs which provide coverage for more than 6 million families to ensure ongoing food security in a country of 30 million inhabitants. Our Venezuela housing mission has, over the last few years, built and handed over more than 3 million decent and comfortable housing units, respecting the concept of habitat and community. We further have missions related to protecting retired persons and older persons. They have benefited more than 5 million retired persons. Further, through our educational missions and everything related to meeting the previous Millennium Development Goals in education, we have projects here that reach more than 6 million children. We provide for school exams and we provide ongoing funding for state education. Turning now to the COVID-19 pandemic, thanks to investments made over the last 20 years, we have been able to provide attention to 99% of the population that has been infected with COVID-19. We've provided medical care, guaranteed medical care, and all of our medical care is provided free for Venezuelan people through our Venezuelan state health system. We, before the United Nations system, ratify our programmatic commitment to meet the 2030 agenda and to ensure the holistic protection of our people in all aspects of their sustainable development. There will be no imperial aggression, blockade, sanctions that can hold back the movement of Venezuela towards social justice and sustainable development, towards happiness, towards the happiness of all of us, as was dreamt by our commander Hugo Chavez and as was sketched out by our liberator Simón Bolívar. Thank you very much.
An SDG moment, what is it? We have set out as small island states to want to pursue development goals which really reflect the SDGs. That is why we have no difficulty in joining the rest of the world in agreeing that we should reach the SDG goals by 2030. For they are truly our development goals. And when many of our countries became independent, these were the things that we wanted to do: to fight against poverty, to fight against hunger, to be able to provide education and healthcare for our people. And when we add all of the other things along the way in fighting inequality and in being able to ensure that we have good water and good sanitation, and we come now to the reality of the 21st century where we've had to include climate because that represents the biggest obstacle in terms of our long-run development that can literally throw us back down to pauperization as middle-income countries. I trust and pray that the world will come together recognizing that these development goals are true and real, not just for countries, but for our citizens, for our people. And when we consider that many of the developing countries in the world, at the time of independence, at the time of the settlement of their affairs, were not given the financial arrangements or access to financing that would allow them to be able to provide for their people as quickly as they would have liked, then we have a duty today to correct those wrongs. Some people call it reparations. We just call it trying to stay the path on the development trajectory and to recognize that out of our existence, out of our development, before we became independent, much was extracted, but not much was left for us to finance our own development. If we want the SDG 2030 agenda to be real, then we need to settle the issue of financing for development. Do our people have the desire to have and to bring development to themselves? Of course we do. But do we have the funding? No, we don't. Do we have the policy space that will trigger growth at an even faster rate? We don't have it, because often criteria and definitions are used to hobble us, not to empower us. So in closing, I'd like to cite Martin Luther King Jr., who said, "It is a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself by his bootstraps." Developing countries, for the most part, as we came out of colonialism, were not given a settlement to allow us to lift ourselves by our bootstraps. Indeed, many instances, we didn't have boots. I trust and pray that in this, the third decade of the 21st century, we will do right, not just by developing countries, but by all people across this globe. With you, Barbados and the Caribbean stand in this noble objective. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished heads of state and government from Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and Barbados. Our final set of countries today fall into the high-income category bracket, and the Western European and other group. Yes, these countries are also hugely challenged on a range of issues, not least the reduction of emissions and action to ensure gender equality and social cohesion. I invite you now to listen to the statements from the distinguished heads of state and government of Austria and Finland.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, greetings from Vienna, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals in Austria. The Austrian government presented our first voluntary national review this year. This review is the outcome of an inclusive process involving not only our national and regional governments, but a variety of stakeholders, academia, businesses, sub-regional authorities, NGOs, and many enthusiastic individuals. We believe that this multi-pronged approach is essential in aiming to transform our world as the SDGs do. At the heart of Austria's national review lies SDG number 13, climate action. Austria has set itself several ambitious goals in this regard. A massive expansion of renewable, non-nuclear energy sources by 2030, phasing out fossil fuels and achieving climate neutrality by 2040. Still, we are aware that none of us can do that alone. Only together can we tackle the climate crisis. Europe, as the richest continent, is required to lead this fight by making the strongest efforts. This is why the European Union has committed to make our continent climate neutral by 2050. At the heart of that effort lies our European growth strategy after the COVID-19 pandemic, the European Green Deal. And we will upgrade our level of ambition further. Instead of a reduction of CO2 emissions by 40% by 2030, Commission President Ursula von der Leyen announced this week that we want to reduce them by 55%. The details will have to be agreed in European legislation, but the direction of travel is clear. There is no time to lose. For the climate crisis, there is no vaccine, no quick fix. We ourselves and our actions are the vaccination. Thank you again for the opportunity. Stay healthy and see you next year in New York.
Madam Deputy Secretary General, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies. We are in the middle of a global crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. The crisis has also brought challenges to many of the Sustainable Development Goals. In addition to the ones focusing on health and poverty, I would like to stress the importance of gender equality. When our societies face turmoil, the rights of women and girls, particularly sexual and reproductive health and rights, are often eroded. We need to be decisive in safeguarding these rights. In order to build a sustainable future, we need the full contribution of women and girls too. Ladies and gentlemen, the current crisis also brings us an opportunity we can't afford to miss. Across the world, we see governments and institutions responding to it with enormous financial stimulus packages. We must make sure that these funds are used cleverly in order to truly build back better and greener. Our recovery now needs to align with the 2030 Agenda, the Paris Climate Agreement, and the Convention on Biological Diversity. Excellencies, achieving the SDGs by 2030 is not possible without adequate financing. Nationally, therefore, Finland will continue to integrate sustainable development into our state budget. Our aim is to have the 2030 Agenda forming the basis for all government policies. We are determined to transform Finland into a socially, economically, and ecologically sustainable society during this decade. And globally, together with our co-chair Chile, Finland is actively engaging the coalition of finance ministers for climate action, now with over 50 members. While managing the ongoing pandemic, we also need to strengthen global resilience to future shocks. We can't achieve it without global cooperation. We can't achieve it without a strong rules-based multilateral system. And we can't achieve it without the Sustainable Development Goals.
I thank the distinguished heads of state and government of Austria and Finland and all the heads of state and government that joined us for their inputs from around the world. Over the last hour, we have heard statements from a diverse range of countries highlighting their efforts, their challenges, their gaps, and their plans. In the final segment of our SDG Moment today, we will hear from a number of stakeholders who are already making a strong contribution to SDG implementation and who have some of the tools and resources needed to support governments to address their gaps and drive the transition to inclusive and sustainable development. We will begin with the discussion I held earlier this week with two of the Secretary General's SDG advocates, young people who don't just represent hope for the future, they embody the power of young people today and incredible capacities of those in vulnerable or minority groups. Take a listen and a watch. Hello, everyone. I'm glad to be joined here by two of the Secretary General's SDG advocates, Eddie Ndopu from South Africa and Hindu Omaru Ibrahim from Chad. Both of you are tireless champions, Eddie for those with disabilities and Hindu for indigenous peoples and climate change. But you both use your voices and influence for those who are consistently left behind and consider the SDGs to be the roadmap for building a better world where no one is left behind. For those watching today, can you both give us a quick taste of how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected communities that you are from? Hindu first, and then Eddie.
Thank you. More than 20,000 in Amazon and many others around the world dead. Indigenous community living in the remote areas, they are impacted by the lack of information, lack of accessing clean water even to drink, so they can't have a soap to wash them hands 4 times a day. And when the market are closed, so they can't exchange them product and is creating food insecurity, economy destroyed and increasing poverty. We are suffering from the health perspective, but from also the consequences of socioeconomic of this crisis.
Eddie?
Well, the truth of the matter is that people with disabilities around the world have been made to disappear from public view. And we are bearing witness to the disappearance of people with disabilities from the discourse around COVID-19. The fact that we use coded language like underlying conditions without explicitly naming people with disabilities is indicative of the disappearance of disabled people. So not only are we fighting for our lives in terms of our health, we are fighting to be incorporated into the global discourse, not just of what a recovery looks like, but who's really being impacted. People with disabilities around the globe live in institutionalized settings, within care homes, and the sheer magnitude of our experience is completely rendered invisible in the context of the discourse around COVID.
So for those in government and the leaders watching, the message you want to send is that the same communities who are already the furthest behind keep bearing the brunt of each new crisis, widening the gap even further. But also your communities cope and even thrive in their own ways. So clearly there are solutions that exist already. Can each of you give the leaders listening today an example of a solution from your community that needs to be supercharged, and tell them what is missing to scale it up and make it a reality. Hindu first and then Eddie.
In this crisis, I also see hope. I see hope because of the solidarity among nations, among communities, and we all face it together united. We will recover from the COVID only if we think big, better, and look forward, building more equal, sustainable, and healthy planet. We all decide in our local communities, we trust them because they are the one who producing the food, who feeding us. So we need to stop burning fossil fuel because it's linked directly to the environmental protections. Recovery should take form in a Green Deal from the companies to the governments to the local authorities. Our leader must learn the lesson of how we can act all at the same time to fight climate change, which is already here, but to also combat the loss of biodiversity because our life and health depend from the environment where we are living. And that is what we are doing with our communities. But of course, 5 years from now to 2015, the SDGs are more needed than ever. And we all know the Paris Agreement and SDGs was launched to protect peoples and planet, but action are missing. So we need a concrete action now from all the head of state, head of government in order to take us out from COVID and protect us from the environmental crisis.
Eddie, go ahead.
I want to echo what my sister Hindu has just spoken about, the need for big ideas. And I would go further and say, we need an intersectional approach to policymaking, because what I have witnessed in my capacity as an SDG advocate is that policymakers tend to view these issues in very compartmentalized ways. So we think about these 17 SDGs as separate from one another, when in fact they are indivisible. And so we need to, the people who are disabled are also people who are indigenous. These are also women because we embody a multiplicity of experiences simultaneously, yet we don't do public policy in a way that is truly intersectional. So I think we need to reimagine the public policy landscape in order to meaningfully address the SDGs in its entirety as an agenda. These are not individual goals that are just glued together and put on a page. These are goals that represent a particular vision of the planet that we want, which is a vision of the planet that is sustainable and that is truly equitable. So I think the ball is in the court of policymakers to really get with the program and start thinking about policy in a deeper, expansive, and intersectional manner.
Well said, both of you. And we do hope that all the leaders here today and watching listen to those words closely and take some inspiration. We'll make a link available so you can watch it back and take some good notes. We just have a few more seconds. So for each of you, what is the one message on the SDGs that you would like viewers today to take away? Hindu?
SDGs are a response to build society that are more resilient. COVID and pandemic are connected to the state of biodiversity. When we damage the earth, we damage our own health. When we protect nature, we protect our health. And indigenous peoples are champions for protecting nature.
Eddie, 15 seconds.
The SDGs are about dignity, about self-actualization. And so when we advance the SDGs, we are advancing the discourse on social justice. This is a moment of global reckoning. It's a sobering time for world leaders to recognize that the SDGs are about people and about planet. It's personal.
Thank you to you both, Hindu Ibrahim and Eddie Ndopu.
Thank you.
All right, that was great. That was about 7 minutes, but we can probably edit it down and chop it up.
Yeah,
so
there were points I think in a lot
let's
of
come
what
back
they
to
were
the
both
floor.
saying. So.
Yeah, okay.
And the order at the end didn't matter, right? You
Got to love a virtual setting.
The order,
Let's fade that audio and come back to me. Really impressive inputs there from Eddie and Hindu. Thank you so much for that. A key point we heard from all our member state representatives is the importance of finance.
from the mobilization of domestic resources to the optimal spending of those resources, from the need for greater international assistance to the need to overhaul our global financial system to drive investments towards the SDGs. And of course, the strain on those resources during the current crisis, COVID-19, is unprecedented. So let's hear now from 4 key voices representing different stakeholders in the world of finance as to their solutions for financing the decade of action. We will hear first from the Managing Director of the World Bank Group, and let me urge you to confine yourselves to the 3 minutes that we've allotted to your speeches. Thank you. 3 minutes starts now.
Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here today representing the World Bank Group. We meet at a dramatic moment in time. Extreme poverty is...
Go ahead.
Extreme poverty is increasing for the first time in a generation. And the bank estimates that more than 100 million will be pushed into extreme poverty this year, and inequality is rising. This is unacceptable. We're seeing this because of falling earnings, that there are millions of people going hungry and deteriorating malnutrition among children. And millions of children are falling behind in school, with school closures and inadequate or non-existent remote learning. And climate change has not gone away. 2020 looks like set to be the hottest year on record, potentially bringing more droughts, floods, and storms that will impact the poorest and most vulnerable people the hardest. We're seeing that the COVID crisis is turning into a humanitarian and development crisis. We need to act, and act now. In this decade of action, it's important that enough resources be mobilized domestically, by countries, and by the international community. Over the last couple of years, the bank has shown that with financial innovation and effective financial policies, we can stretch our balance sheet and our ability to support the SDGs. We need more of this innovation so that the international community can generate the resources needed to help the countries that so desperately need our support. This is the challenge today. It will be the challenge tomorrow. And the World Bank Group is ready to tackle it today and over the long haul. Last fiscal year, the World Bank had its largest lending program ever at 59 billion. This year, not only do we want to scale up our resources for the poorest countries, making available $35 billion through IDA, but also we want to support middle-income countries with $35 billion as well. Our colleagues from IFC are pushing for a similar ambitious engagement through investments with the private sector. We are focused on helping countries respond to health, economics, and social impacts of the crisis and rebuild better. First, we are stepping up our commitments on climate. We're adding another 24 billion this year to the 83 billion in climate investment we have supported over the last 5 years. On health, we are working on both immediate COVID response in over 100 countries while helping countries strengthen health systems to better withstand future health shocks. And on gender, we are focused on closing gaps between women and men by removing constraints to more and better jobs and to prevent and respond to gender-based violence, and working low-income and fragile countries to improve the access and quality of sexual and reproductive health services. And on education, we are aiming at $7 billion this year in education funding, working in 65 countries to implement remote learning strategies and working with UNICEF and UNESCO on school reopening frameworks. This crisis calls for a response that recognizes the interconnectedness between economic systems, human health and well-being, and planetary health. It offers an opportunity for countries to build back a more resilient, sustainable, and inclusive world. The bank will continue to work with the international community where the SDGs provide a powerful framework for action, and our financing is very much aligned. So thank you for this moment, and let me assure you of the World Bank's group commitment to working together with all of you to help countries through the COVID crisis, as well as to get countries back on track to their long-term development goals. Together with solidarity and with financial support, we can help the countries who need it most. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Axel von Trossenberg, Managing Director of the World Bank Group. Next up is a South African economist specializing in macroeconomic policy, including tax justice. Over to Busi Sebeka, and Busi, you have 3 minutes.
Thank you. Sustainable Development Goals will require a reimagining of macroeconomic policies and frameworks in ways that are human-centered and intersectional. It will require global fiscal solidarity. Interventionist fiscal policies will be critical. Our research on Africa in particular has demonstrated that at times, government have underutilized their fiscal space to change the socioeconomic realities of their citizens. Governments will need to utilize and create fiscal space in order to achieve their SDGs. Contrary to fiscal consolidation practices, government expenditure will need to expand in areas such as health, education, and other areas of social protection. Governments will also need to invest in green and purple economies. The former refers to environmentally sustainable expenditure, and the latter to the care economy. The care economy, for instance, has been shown to have high fiscal multipliers, which will benefit the economy and in turn enable the financing of the SDGs. Spending on the SDGs will pay for itself. The redistribution of wealth and income will be critical. Wealth taxes and higher income taxes will need to be considered and implemented at national levels. At the international level, combating illicit financial flows will be an example of how we can redistribute wealth globally. Through global fiscal solidarity, we should collectively think about introducing minimum global taxes to end the race to the bottom. In terms of debt, in an effort for global fiscal solidarity, debt relief and forgiveness, unconditional, should be given to countries that have chronically been indebted. We must acknowledge how debt is reflective of systematic global inequalities. Focusing on external debt weakens countries' capacities to prioritize the SDGs. In terms of borrowing, countries will need financing that is not conditional, at least not in the traditional ways. Therefore, we must reimagine and reform international financial institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF to gear them towards financing the SDGs. In terms of monetary policy, we will need to consider non-conventional tools. For some countries, this means, for instance, abandoning inflation targeting. Finally, participation and transparency need to be centered in how we move forward. New social compacts must be forged. The role of civil society stakeholders, such as myself, will be to provide rigorous economic analysis and evidence-based policy recommendations to our governments. COVID-19 has demonstrated that we can no longer afford to do more of the same. Thank you.
Thank you for coming in under 3 minutes. We appreciate it. We turn now to two more African voices. First, Ms. Leila Fourie, CEO of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, followed by Ms. Kalila Kelsmbowe, CEO and founder of Unleashed Africa Social Ventures Youth Disruption.
Good day, distinguished guests and partners in sustainability. The impact of the COVID-19 pandemic is historic. If we pay attention to the history books, we will find that they contain important lessons which may help us to avoid the mistakes of the past and rebuild a more resilient and, importantly, more equitable world. In the past, the large financial markets of advanced economies have played an important role in the post-crisis recovery. Emerging markets were largely excluded from such an experience. With each passing period of economic pressure, the inequality gap between the advanced world and the developing world widens further. We cannot allow this to continue. The immediate reaction to the crisis has seen historic levels of stimulus being pumped into economies to manage the short-term demands of the crisis. Unfortunately, the emerging world finds itself with an affordability issue. Added to this, the pressure of poor health infrastructures, high debt service costs, and a declining tax revenue base, and we have an expensive problem with a hole in the purse. If emerging economies turn to traditional financing strategies, this means a further rise in public debt levels and an almost certain delay in achieving the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The irony of this outcome is that those countries most in need of the SDGs are also the ones most at risk for rising inequality. In summary, the challenge is clear. Emerging market economies need access to affordable funding to end the cycle of indebtedness. Emergency loans at lower interest rates have indeed been a good step towards addressing the issue. But the extent of pre-crisis debt means that they are anchored in rising waters. Debt is just half of the affordability issue. The other half is revenue. And revenue comes from growth. As the private sector rebuilds, they have the power to align to the SDGs. The combined effort of public-private sector has the ability to maintain momentum in the adoption of the SDGs. In South Africa at the JSE, we launched a suite of sustainability bonds, which we believe are more relevant now than ever. In the time of crisis, we turn to the history books to guide us. We must ensure that the story that we pen this time is one to be proud of, one that builds for the future, one that builds back better.
When I started my company, Unleashed Africa, in 2016, I was told that I would not make it because I was young, a female, and to some, did not have the right skin color. This was because I chose a disruptive path, one that looked at things as they are and chose to say, no, I am going to do something else, something big, impactful. Unleashed Africa Social Ventures works at the intersection of youth development, social innovation, and job creation. In and through my work, I am driven to use systems thinking to unearth intrinsic challenges associated with some of Africa's most pressing challenges, mainly associated with youth. I looked in how we can tap into frequently overlooked and glossed over talent pockets on the continent, create and strengthen value systems and value chains, all the while focusing on integrating technology and innovation for scale. My company focuses on creative arts and development, gender, and social enterprise ecosystem development. We design, create, and develop products, projects, and programs that not only connect young people to sustainable income-generating opportunities, but also create avenues for them to grow as leaders in their own right. Our goals are to provide decent work, upskill, empower youth leadership, enable the growth of social enterprises, and strengthen the capacity of young women to execute on their dreams. In my work, it is critical to think about 360-degree solutions. Having the right partnerships is key. As the African proverb says, it takes a village. I am not out to build an SME. My goal is to build an African giant. Big businesses that focus on the triple bottom line, people and impact, profits and sustainability, planet and conservation. This is not the time for small-time solutions. If the past few months have taught us anything, it is that we need to get our planning hats off and get our hands and feet dirty as we truly push humanity forward, not just talk about it. We cannot afford to tolerate inequality in any sphere. We cannot afford to tolerate poverty, poor healthcare, and inadequate education that is leading our world nowhere. No one left behind. Do we truly believe it? We are only as weak as our weakest link. Hence, by not truly and authentically dreaming big and executing together, we ruin our chances not only for collective survival, but prosperity. Pamoja is the only way forward. The bicker of politics, blame, and allure of self-interest do not serve us. We must awaken to our collective need and dare to be brave enough to abandon the status quo, take courage and ask difficult questions, and open the doors for new possibilities. We need the right type of financing, proper skilling and upskilling, enabling policies, and a true common agenda for progress. The next 10 years will have a lot to tell about the side of history that we decided to sit on. I choose to go big. I choose bravery and daring, empathy and authenticity. I choose holistic progress for all, to live a legacy that will leave a legacy. What side do you choose to sit on today?
Preach, Kalila, preach. Thank you to our finance speakers. Let's now move to hear about the actions that other stakeholders are taking to bring solutions and overcome these gaps, from civil society coalitions to local governments and the private sector. Let's start looking at what is being done around climate action. I now have the pleasure to invite contributions from Ms. Nasreen Al-Saim, a climate activist from Sudan, Mr. Brad Smith of Microsoft, Ms. Yvonne Akisoya, the mayor of Freetown, and Ms. Christiana Figueres, Mission 2020.
Distinguished guests, I'm very glad to be here with you today, and thank you for His Excellency Antonio Guterres for giving the floor and also for arranging this event. I will be speaking in Arabic as it's my mother tongue, so please use your translator. سيداتي أنساتي سادتي مع حفظ جميع.
Ladies and gentlemen, today I'm taking the floor in order to reiterate the importance of the SDGs and on all of the efforts made by the young people in order to make sure that they have a future. The stakeholders of the civil society play an important role in order to facilitate the implementation of governmental decisions and also to exert pressure so as to protect the interests of citizens. We underscore the cooperation between the citizens and the government. 60% of people in Africa are young. It's 2/3 of the world population, and despite that, the young people are suffering from poverty, unemployment, and climate change impact. The young people act internationally in order to help their societies adapt to climate change. They also make an effort to work with governments and arrive at policies which take into account the new health and economic conditions. Major demonstrations have been organized by the young people internationally, and we have seen this locally. We have seen the pressure they exert on governments in developing countries in order to implement the Agenda 2030, and also in developed countries where they demonstrate for a green future world and in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions throughout the world. But despite all of that, the young people today are suffering Fortunately, the United Nations Secretary General came up with a decision to have an advisory group of young people, and it is my pleasure to be part of that advisory body to work on climate change and to make sure that the voice of the Secretary General is heard in all of the meetings on the young people. We speak on behalf of the young people, and we will maintain the contact with the Secretary General in order to work on the issues of climate and the environment. We want to underscore the health of this planet in order to make sure that we prosper in future. Our responsibility here is increasing. Several challenges present themselves today. Government companies do not really discuss the real issues, do not want to face reality. We can see the fires in California, in the Amazon, in Syria, in Africa, in Europe. And in those areas, we're talking about the lungs of the planet, and this also impacts biodiversity throughout the world. Many countries throughout the world are also impacted by climate change and climate-related disasters. "7,000 people died in Sudan since 2014 because of climate-related issues and floods, and also a lot of damage has been done by that. And this applies not just to Sudan, of course. Floods are a common issue in many areas of this world. In addition to that, there are fires growing in intensity. The speaker is very difficult to hear. We have to continue repeating that development is only possible provided we combat climate change. This is the only guarantee for us to implement the SDGs. We have to work to promote environmental issues and benefit from the natural resources that we have. If we don't work on climate-related issues, we will be facing other pandemics. If we do not work on climate.
Away from that, it's way over the 3 minutes we've allocated. I do apologize for that. Next up, Brad Smith from Microsoft.
Hello, I'm Microsoft President Brad Smith. This is a key time for all of us to come together to use this year's UN General Assembly to focus on what we each need to do to help meet the Sustainable Development Goals by the year 2030. This decade could hardly be more important, and let's face it, it could hardly have started with a more difficult set of circumstances. But out of what we're learning from this crisis around COVID-19, I think we can build a foundation, not just to strengthen and rebuild what we had before, but to reimagine what we can do together to achieve the SDGs. Now, all 17 of the SDGs are obviously important, but I think one question for each of us is to ask, where can we have the greatest impact? At Microsoft, we're putting our energy into 3 above all else. It starts with skills for us, because in so many ways, digital technology and data is at the core of what people are going to need in terms of skills for the jobs of the future. That's why we've used this year to embark on a new initiative, a global skilling initiative to reach 25 million people around the world by the end of this year. It's why we're working through LinkedIn, which Microsoft owns, to provide free access to content. We're pulling together our other resources to provide subsidized access to exams and certifications, the types of certifications that people need to get jobs. And we're using our resources then to connect with people through nonprofits around the world to actually help people find the jobs of the future. That's one of the pillars as we look at where we can make a difference. Of course, we also recognize that one of the big learnings for the world this year is the importance of access to the internet. And increasingly, that means accessing the internet at broadband speeds. As we've been saying, broadband is the electricity of the 21st century. We need to bring it to more people. That's why we're working literally around the world with new technologies like TV white spaces, with a goal of serving 40 million people in the next few years, 40 million people who don't have access to broadband today. Finally, there's one other priority on which we at Microsoft are focused, one of the other SDGs, and that's around sustainability. We will only succeed as a planet if we each do our part. And we think the business community can rally globally and make a huge contribution. At Microsoft, we began the year by committing that we'll be carbon negative by the year 2030, and we will remove from the environment by 2050 all the carbon that Microsoft has emitted since we were founded in 1975. We're moving quickly to do this through a $1 billion climate innovation fund that is investing in new technologies for carbon removal. by expanding our internal carbon tax and using the fees that are generated to accelerate our own adoption of renewable energy, so that by 2025, all of our data centers and all of our offices worldwide will be running on green energy. We're accelerating our work to remove carbon as well. We just issued the biggest RFP in history, an RFP that will enable us to remove 1 million metric tons of carbon just in the next 12 months alone. And of course, the world's sustainability needs don't stop with a focus on carbon alone. That's why we've combined our commitment to be carbon negative by the year 2030 with another commitment to be water positive by the end of the decade as well, so that we're not only recycling water for our own use, but we're investing in water replenishment, in wetlands and other critical natural resources. And we've committed that we'll be zero waste by the end of the decade as well. Clearly, we need to focus on all of these, as well as the biodiversity of the planet. It's hard to imagine a decade that could begin with a more glaring set of challenges that the world is confronting. But like all glaring challenges, it's also shining a spotlight on the opportunities for the future. If we can use that spotlight, not only to make it through this year, but to inspire and mobilize all of us around the world to do what it takes, then I believe that we can each do our part and make the Sustainable Development Goals a reality by the year 2030. Thank you.
My name is Ivana Kisoyer, and I'm the mayor of Freetown, Sierra Leone. As we talk today about climate, environmental sustainability, and bridging the gap, the inequality gap at the time of COVID, I'd like to highlight just a few of the things that we're doing here in our city. In respect of climate, we look at this from the perspective of both adaptation and climate action. With adaptation, because climate change is already here, and we are already suffering and experiencing abnormally heavy rainfalls, which bring with them the risk of flooding. So on an adaptation side, we have introduced flood mitigation. It's a program that we run every rainy season, allowing us to ensure that over 10,000 meters of drains are cleared. This rainy season alone, 71 culverts, 42 bridges, just to ensure that as the rain falls, there is a clear path for it, and that comes alongside work on sanitation and improving sanitation, which also reduces methane emissions in our city. Moving on to sustainable action on flood mitigation, and not just sustainable but deeper, we have instituted or launched this year Freetown the Tree Town. Our plan to plant 1 million trees in our city, reducing runoff from the hillsides, but also increasing that much needed carbon sink in these days of climate change. And with this rainy season, 500,000 seedlings are already going into the ground. Seedlings that will be nurtured by the tree stewards that plant them, and that will be monitored by the community-based organizations that are providing monetary services, because it's not just about planting trees, but growing them. And we talk now about COVID and what that means when there's already such inequality built into our city. 35% of our residents live in informal settlements. They're vulnerable. They have poor access to water, sanitation, drainage. These are all actions, or these are all challenges we were seeking to address as part of our Transform Freetown agenda. COVID has brought it to the forefront, and our interventions during COVID have enabled us to bring water to these communities more quickly with simple rainwater harvesting systems. We've been able to give out 120,000 masks. Where you are not able to socially distance, at least you should be able to protect yourself. And we've done that with our Mask Up Freetown campaign in partnership with many local and international partners, and we want to thank them all. But we also have introduced, again with partners' support and with partnership with the central government, a community care center, which has enabled those living in informal settlements who can't socially distance if they are asymptomatic but positive, providing a space for them to be safely cared for. When it comes to sustaining these actions, it's not just about COVID, but beyond. And here we've also introduced, or are introducing, urban farming into our informal settlements. So COVID has enabled us, or really has pushed us, to accelerate some of what we had wanted to do under Transform Freetown, which has at its heart climate action and environmental sustainability. Thank you.
Dear representatives of the member states, dear stakeholders, we all know that we are in the middle of an unprecedented crisis. But it is not just the health crisis and the economic crisis. It is also the climate change crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and underlying all of that, the inequality crisis. We did not ask for all of these crises to converge, but they have. And since they have converged, it is our responsibility to make our solutions to those crises also converge. We cannot afford to sequentially address those crises. We have to be able to converge those solutions. We have already, as a world economy, allotted at least $12 trillion to the economic recovery packages, and that could go up to $20 trillion. At that scale of fresh capital being injected into the global economy, that capital will determine the carbon intensity of the global economy for at least a decade. And that decade, the decade of the 20s, is precisely the decade of action on SDGs and the decisive decade on climate change. By 2030, we have to have delivered the SDGs and have cut our greenhouse gas emissions globally by 1/2. That is the only way that we can open the door to a world that is more prosperous, more just, more healthy, and more stable. So we must ensure that as we make these decisions to deploy that capital, that we do so into the jobs and the sectors that are going to take us all the way through the decade into delivering on the SDGs and cutting down on emissions. We can do all at the same time through very careful deployment of the capital that has now been made available. And let us remember that that capital is capital that we are borrowing from our children. Therefore, let us make sure, because they will have to pay that bill, let us make sure that that capital is being invested for their benefit and not to their detriment. This is a crisis that we cannot afford to waste. It is the most important opportunity that humankind has ever faced. We can do this if we do it together.
Thank you, Christiana. We heard now from our last round of speakers on how climate action can go hand in hand with reducing inequality. There are a number of other actions that will support countries in this endeavor: empowering young people, eliminating discrimination against women and girls, and reorienting business models so as to increase access to jobs for all. Our next three speakers are translating their advocacy and wider societal and business demands to make a practical difference every day. Let's start with Ms. Natasha Mwansa, a journalist and health advocate from Zambia. We will then hear from Mr. Danny Srikandaraja, CEO of Oxfam, and Ms. Hakima Abbas, a co-executive director of the Association for Women's Rights in Development.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. It is such an honor to be here, and I do not take it lightly. Of course, thank you so much to the UNSG and every other partner stakeholder here, girls on this platform, and just talk about equality and how sustainability looks on that end. When the global pandemic began, I had been running a foundation, the Natasha Mwansa Foundation, where I am the founder and executive director. And when it hit us, I had no idea on what to do next. And the closest thing I could think of was to run for help from someone who was already doing so well with their organization. And when I spoke to her, she gave me advice that helped me run the foundation even during this period. Now, this was advice that I hadn't even thought I'd ever be asking for, because no one knew that we would be hit with this pandemic. However, she did open me up to ideas in numerous ways in which we could apply innovation and creativity to continue running the foundation. The foundation runs and works with young people entirely. And by then we had only close to 20 members, but right now the foundation has got over 200 members, and this growth has been experienced during this period itself. Now, the reason I am giving this example is because when we talk about sustainability, we cannot take away from the fact that there is need for serious mentorship from people who are already taking the lead now. The global pandemic has shown us that women all over the world are taking the lead on how exactly they have been able to, get rid of cases in their own country, in their home countries. But then we do know what they're doing, and we're very inspired by their work. But then as the younger generation, we understand the how of it all. Sustainability is a very important thing, and that is all that we talk about when we talk about the SDGs. However, one of the greatest drivers of sustainability is leadership. And if leaders are not able to reproduce themselves in the younger generation now, then we're going to bridge a huge gap for the future generations, because we will be very zealous and we will do all that it takes. However, without understanding of what it takes and how to do it, then there lies a huge danger. And if another pandemic hits us, then we will not know what to do. Hence, there is need to be very deliberate in investing in not just intergenerational dialogue, which is highly appreciated. However, it has to go beyond and take it all the way to intergenerational mentorship, where I can be trained by other world leaders on how to be a leader of today and create a better world for those that are coming tomorrow. And another thing that we also need to really invest in, even as I am from Africa, and Africa is a very wonderful place. It has so many resources. However, it has got so much potential that is not unleashed yet. And the saddest thing is, one of the greatest drivers and opportunities for us to unleash this potential is our education system. However, this education system needs to be redesigned and restructured to be able to help us ourselves actually understand and discover our own potential. Education still remains the greatest equalizer, just as Nelson Mandela once taught us. And even Malala Yousafzai once said it, with guns we can kill terrorists, but then with education we can kill terrorism. Education is the key factor that we need to actually bring equality on the ground in all sorts of fields, and hence we should not ignore in investing in the education sector and redesigning it so that it can be able to help us even be more innovative and discover our own potentials for future crises like this, for us to actually be able to handle it. Another key thing that we've come to see and realize is that our health is the most important treasure that we hold. Without our health, everything goes on lockdown.
Natasha, please wrap.
It's important to understand that the only way that we'll ever progress in the health sector...
Natasha, I need you to wrap, please. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I need you to say your final word.
Has shown us is through partnership. And this is why my favorite SDG...
Apologies, Natasha Mwansa. We had to, unfortunately, cut you short there and move over to our next speaker, Danny Srikandaraja, the CEO of Oxfam.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the invitation to Oxfam to speak today. I'm here to raise the voices of the communities around the world that we and other civil society organizations exist to serve, the very communities whose lives the SDGs are designed to improve and transform. A key part of our sector's role is to challenge leaders to act in the public interest, to hold you accountable for the impact of your decisions, and to work with you in partnership in key aspects of sustainable development. As you know, the pandemic and the climate crisis are not being felt equally. Sadly, the greatest impact falls on the lives of those who are already living precariously. A farmer in Ethiopia battling climate change as well as COVID-19. A care worker in the United Kingdom who is struggling to get by on her low pay while her work has become more dangerous. A taxi driver in Kenya whose work has dried up overnight, who fears his family will starve before the virus makes them sick. Oxfam estimates that by the end of the year, 12,000 people per day could die from hunger linked to COVID-19, potentially more than what will die from the disease itself. I say this not as a harbinger of doom, but to underline how important the goals and the spirit of solidarity that underpins them are today more than ever. But if we're to succeed, if we're to prevent the world from becoming more unequal as a result of these crises, then efforts to achieve the goals will need to be supercharged. We need to see member states, multilateral institutions, and the private sector setting out ambitious plans around Agenda 2030. And we need bold new ideas. For example, governments providing a basic social floor to all citizens, with richer nations contributing to a global fund for social protection to support those who lack adequate resources. We need radical action to reach net zero emissions as quickly as possible. This is an opportunity to overhaul shareholder capitalism so that the benefits of success are shared more widely, so that tax is paid more fairly and that workers are more protected. We believe that an international summit on economic reconstruction and systemic reform could be an opportunity to agree ambitious responses to the pandemic and remove barriers to socio-economic transformation. Around the world, citizens are rising. People are demanding action to end racism, to create sustainable economies, for men and women to be equals. All of us at this meeting, from member states to organizations like ours, must heed these calls. Delivering on the SDGs will give us not just the best chance of building back better from the pandemic, but also of achieving the more equal and sustainable world that we so desperately need. Thank you.
Thanks, Danny. The next speaker is Hakima Abbas, Co-Executive Director of the Association for Women's Rights and Development. You have 3 minutes only. Please stick to the time limit. Thank you.
Agenda, 25 years since Beijing. And while there has been for women's rights and gender justice, the structural transformation that people and planet so desperately need remains elusive. According to the 2019 SDG Index by Equal Measures, nearly 40% of the world's girls and women, 1.4 billion, live in countries that are failing on gender equality. Not unsurprisingly, they also found that countries overall have performed best on issues where coordinated and concerted policy focus and funding has been directed over the past 10 to 20 years. We need long-term concerted commitments to women's rights and gender equality. As bold and as transformative as our commitments may sound, on women's rights and gender equality, we continue to tinker on the edges of action. Yet the global pandemic has been a moment of reckoning with the consequences of the ecological devastation we are perpetrating, a reckoning with the complete lack of social safety nets in many of our countries, the consequences of decades of imposed neoliberal policies, and in particular, of the privatization of health. In many countries, the pandemic is being used to deepen authoritarianism, to accelerate occupation, to pass laws that roll back reproductive rights and deepen surveillance. And the pandemic has triggered an unprecedented economic crisis, pushing many more people into impoverishment, while the wealth of billionaires and transnational corporations has grown exponentially in amounts that are unprecedented in the history of modern markets. Yet in this turmoil, we have also seen alternatives bloom, where community mutual aid and care systems, solidarity networks have sprung to action, like landless workers' movements in Brazil or the women's groups of Kerala who are providing food, health, education, and support in their communities. Women all over the world created and drew on networks of collective care. Throughout the world, feminists have built rapid response giving circles, emergency and solidarity funds to support their communities, like migrant sex workers in Asia or urban poor in Kenya. What we were told was impossible 6 months ago has been done. For example, private hospitals have been put to public use, albeit for the short term. Bold propositions such as ideas around universal basic income, debt cancellation, police and prison abolition, reparations, and divesting from the industry of war must be considered. Throughout the world, we've witnessed incredible and creative organizing from feminists, young people, people with disabilities, Black people, and other social movements, demanding that there be no going back to what was considered and should never have been normal. We cannot accept authoritarianism and the carceral state, gender-based violence against women, girls, trans, intersex, and gender non-binary people, economic systems that privilege the already privileged, that ignore and undervalue the essential work of women and informal workers, and that commodify our resources, our territories, and our cultures. Ecological collapse, unfettered greed, and consumption and accumulation, so-called growth.
Akima, I have to interrupt.
Alternatives existed before the pandemic in the agroecology and food sovereignty of peasants and small farmers.
Thank you, Hakima. Thank you, Hakima. Apologies, we are running way over time. Thank you for the input from our stakeholders. And thank you to our final speakers who really captured the urgency of what we need to do to deliver the SDGs. Ladies and gentlemen, we have reached the end of our first SDG moment. To ensure we build momentum over the coming year, we will hear closing statements now from the President of the Economic and Social Council and the UN Deputy Secretary General. The ECOSOC is the UN's mothership for sustainable development. It's key intergovernmental forums on financing for development, on overseeing the UN's development operations around the world, and the high-level political forum are the primary global platforms for follow-up and review of SDG implementation. Today, we heard a snapshot of SDG progress, but each year, these forums will build on those that go before it, providing even more in-depth and comprehensive analysis as we accelerate our march towards 2030. It is now my pleasure, therefore, to invite His Excellency, Mr. Munir Akram, President of the Economic and Social Council, to outline how the ECOSOC will help us move the 2030 agenda forward over the coming year. No mean feat, sir. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Distinguished Deputy Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I thank the heads of state and government who intervened today, as well as others who have participated in this meeting for their valuable contributions to our shared commitment to the implementation of the SDGs. The global magnitude of the challenge we are facing today from the COVID pandemic is the gravest since the creation of the United Nations. COVID-19 is inflicting unparalleled human suffering. Nearly 1 million people have died, and hundreds of millions are at risk. The hard-fought development progress made over a decade has been vitiated. More than 100 million people will fall back into extreme poverty. The achievement of the 2030 agenda is therefore much more challenging now. Therefore, the highest priority we have is to control the virus. We must hope that a vaccine will be available in the very near future, and we must commit ourselves to ensure that everyone, rich or poor, everywhere, will have equal and affordable access to the vaccine without discrimination. Excellencies, the development challenge is threefold. First, the COVID-19 crisis, which has devastated the world economy with a global contraction which could go up to 20%. Second, the challenge of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030. We have all heard that we need to redouble efforts to achieve those targets. Third, the climate catastrophe, which is going to happen unless we act now. Excellencies, my own priorities as President of the Economic and Social Council is to focus on practical actions. First, on financing. We need to find the financing required to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic and to build back better. The Managing Director of the IMF has estimated that we need to mobilize 2.5 trillion for the developing countries to respond to this crisis. The proposals discussed in the initiative launched by the Secretary General, Canada and Jamaica need to be followed up, and they would need to be followed up in the Economic and Social Council's Forum on Financing for Development to ensure that the commensurate commitments will be made to make that degree of financing available. Second, infrastructure. Sustainable infrastructure is key to promoting all 17 SDG goals. It impacts on 92% of these goals. We need to focus on investment in sustainable infrastructure, renewable energy, transportation, housing, water, sanitation. Unless we are able to invest about $1.5 trillion additionally every year in the developing countries, we will fall back further from achieving the SDGs. I have proposed the establishment of an infrastructure investment facility as a public-private partnership to accelerate sustainable infrastructure development in the developing countries. Third, science and technology. We need to focus on clear, identifiable actions. Firstly, I believe we should try to align the intellectual property regime with the SDGs. Secondly, we need to identify precise goals for research and development, goals which are the most critical ones for the achievement of the SDGs. And thirdly, we need to find ways to bridge the digital divide between the North and the South. Excellencies, I will shortly commence informal consultations with interested parties, member states, the UN Secretariat, and other organizations, as well as the private sector and civil society stakeholders on each of these areas. I am most grateful for the support extended to me by the Secretary General, by the Deputy Secretary General, DESA, UNCTAD, UNDP, and others in the UN family in these endeavors to address our challenges and to build back better. I thank you very much.
I thank Ambassador Akram for his remarks. Now we will play a video just before I introduce the Deputy Secretary General, a video that really captures what we've been talking about here today. Let's take a look at that before I introduce the DSG.
In 2015, we resolved to build a better future for all people, including the millions who have been denied the chance to lead decent, dignified lives and to achieve their full potential. The UN has partnered with countries, communities, and partners around the world to support and elevate this SDG ambition. Today, we work in solidarity to overcome the health and development crisis caused by COVID-19 and support those most vulnerable to economic hardships and social disruption. The SDG moment is now. Our choices today determine the future. We can be the first generation to succeed in ending poverty, just as we may be the last to have a chance of saving the planet.
Okay, to conclude, I invite the Deputy Secretary General, Ms. Amina Mohammed, to bring this moment to a close. If this was a game of cricket, we'd call her the sweeper, and to set the decade of action off on an ambitious and energetic start. The Deputy Secretary General was not only central to creating the SDGs, as chair of the UN Sustainable Development Group, she is central to ensuring the UN makes the maximum contribution possible to their achievement. Madam Deputy Secretary General, you have the floor.
Thank you so very much. Distinguished heads of state and government, our President of the General Assembly, the President of ECOSOC, all of those amazing people that are watching us today. Thank you for staying through this, and my heartfelt thanks for all of you making this first SDG moment truly inspiring. And I'm going to just say a couple of words about what I heard, particularly from our stakeholders. From Eddie, who ended by saying that what really this message was about was dignity, social justice, a sobering time, and ended with, it's personal. to Microsoft, who talked about the global skilling and how they were bringing education for jobs and supporting that, looking at water replenishment, to the wonderful mayor of Freetown, who was talking about planting trees for the hillsides, but she said beyond the planting, we're actually going to be growing. And she also linked that to the jobs. To Christiana, of course, our climate activist, the capital that we borrow from our children has to be paid by them. And so think about it. What capital are we putting out? And then I would like to say to our three young people, Hakima, Natasha, Nizreen, who had so much to say. I think we needed another 3 hours to hear them, but let me assure you, we will spend the next year and 10 years working with you, not just hearing you. The moment has truly set the stage for a decade of action, and the SG has made it abundantly clear that we can and we must and we will succeed. The COVID-19 crisis is testing every country in the world, that is threatening decades of progress and certainly undermining our plans to deliver the goals. But it is also an opportunity to do things differently, to make great leaps forward, to imagine a better future, and to collaborate to make it a reality, to defeat COVID. Today's event showed humanity's capacity for change and progress. You highlighted the ambitious and rapid response that you have taken to respond to COVID-19. And you spoke to the need for the same ambition, urgency, innovation on climate action, on gender equality, and ending extreme poverty on all of our sustainable development goals. Now is the time to make bold choices and take decisive action and leave absolutely no one behind, all in pursuit of a better future. Of course, over the last 3 hours, we've heard about 5 major shifts that will be central to our efforts. The first, investing at scale in those critical interventions, social protection, the green and blue economies, women's economic empowerment, all will unlock tremendous benefits across the goals, across our societies and economies, and throughout the decade of action. Second, improving access to finance for those countries and those people who urgently need it, and redirecting global investment towards the Sustainable Development Goals. This is a central focus of the initiative launched by the Secretary General, together with the Prime Ministers of Canada and Jamaica, for financing development, not just in the era of COVID-19, but much beyond it. Third, making greater and better use of data and technology to leave no one behind and build skills for youth, including, to quote the UNDP administrator, by making digital the default. Today, we're launching a dedicated digital platform for the SDG Moment. We will continue to press for greater investment in data for the SDGs. Fourth, we must strengthen and revolutionize the capacities of national, local, and global institutions to take a truly intersectional approach. This is key to realizing human rights, to reaching the most excluded, to seizing the opportunities of today's world, and to meeting public expectations. Finally, throughout the morning, we heard about the power of the collection action to deliver. Leaders from civil society and business spoke about the inclusion imperative and the need for big ideas and the need to move forward in solidarity. The UN development system, reformed and dynamic, is ready to support this vital work across the world with you in our socioeconomic response and recovery. Excellencies, friends, we do have a clear way ahead, but we do have a great deal of work to do. The people of the world are looking to all of us, heads of state and governments, the United Nations, key stakeholders, all of us to step up and to lead. The coming 12 months present several opportunities to do so and to put the SDGs at the core of your plans and actions to respond and recover from the crisis. We need to bring SDG ambition into our support for a universally accessible vaccine, the people's vaccine, into the financing track, into your voluntary national reviews, your nationally determined contributions for climate action, and your engagement during this crucial year for gender equality and biodiversity, remembering that we commemorate Beijing Plus 25 next week. I thank the heads of state and government who have spoken today for putting their administrations fully behind the 2030 agenda. Special appreciation to the leadership of the Secretary General, the inspiration of his that carries us here today, together with the President of the General Assembly and the President of ECOSOC. I thank our stakeholders, representatives, and our contributors from the UN family for their clarity and their vision, and our moderator, Sherwin, for guiding us so skillfully and professionally, knitting together a really difficult virtual event. This event would not have been possible without the support of our colleagues, leaders in our institutions, but those teams that have worked night and day behind the scenes, and many of them here in this room today. But thank you, because you made this a reality beyond the virtual. Let the 2020 SDG moment propel us into a transformative decade of action. Now really is the time to demonstrate the value of multilateralism and deliver hope, opportunities, sustainable development for all. We have our homework set out for us. See you next year, where we will continue this movement, moving closer to delivering on the SDGs by 2030. I thank you.
Thank you, DSG, and thank you for your leadership, and certainly a remarkable team pulling all these videos and elements together for this SDG moment. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the 2020 SDG moment. It leaves me only to thank all of you for joining us here in New York and online, and to remind you to tune into the Nations United broadcast live on UN Web TV and the UN's YouTube channel from 9 a.m. Eastern, 3 p.m. Central African Time, 1 p.m. GMT tomorrow. This 2020 SDG moment is now concluded. I thank you.